A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
Last month, a storm bore down on our small town, thick clouds roiling in a way that felt almost foreboding. It felt like that storm had crept right into my neighbor Lisa's home, too, when she staggered over to my porch, eyes wide and disheveled, clutching her phone like it was a hot coal. "I think I need to go to the hospital," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and fear, but it wasn't the words that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the way she said it, as though she was trying so hard to keep it together but knowing her grip on reality was slipping. I could see her young son, Thomas, peeking from behind the screen door, those big, innocent eyes wide with confusion, and suddenly that shiver transforming into a full-blown shudder as I imagined how scared he must be at that moment. What had started as a simple rainstorm turned into an unbearable weight swirling in my stomach. I hadn't had the best relationship with Lisa, she rarely reached out unless she needed something, and here she was, practically demanding I take care of Thomas just so she could feel free enough to leave. The storm rumbled ominously overhead, and I didn't want to find myself plunged into the chaos of her life, so I hesitated for a heartbeat too long before saying, but frankly, I couldn't even finish that one pathetic little word before she started begging, "Please, I've tried calling a babysitter, but they're all busy. I can't leave him. Not now." I could see that desperation and fear were mixing into a cocktail of urgency, and my insides twisted as I imagined the looming hospital visit, thoughts racing through my mind about what it might reveal. What if something terrible was going on? What if I said yes and it spiraled downward? I shook my head, feeling my resolve harden despite the fluttering anxiety in my chest. I told her, "I'm really sorry, Lisa, but I can't. I have plans." It wasn't a lie, my nerves had been frayed by last week's sleepless nights and the dreadful anxiety that came with the unknown. There was something inside me that whispered she'd find someone else, and while I pressed my lips together to silence it, it only amplified in the silence. Her face fell, anger momentarily flashing in those wild eyes before they pooled with tears, and just then as the wind picked up, a small rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, resonating the storm's resonance with her heartbreak. "You're a monster," she hissed, and although I sucked in a breath, ready to explain how I wasn't prepared for her chaos, the moment just shattered. "All I'm asking is for a few hours," she continued, her voice trembling. "What would you do in my place?" I realized this was no longer about me or my panic. I had to find what was beneath my refusal. What was the cost now that I had said it out loud? I could feel guilt creeping into the corners of my heart, coupling with my relentless anxiety. I had just locked myself out of something elemental. She twisted away from me, storm clouds roiling in her eyes as she retreated, that small hand of her son reaching for her, this sweet boy who didn't understand anything beyond a child's innocence. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, that I would pay for my refusal. And just as I started to make amends with myself, an ominous message flashed on my phone very late one night. A simple text read, "Lisa was found." I felt an oppressive weight in my chest, burying me in doubt. The words "found" could mean anything, yet they stood stark against the solitude of night, intensifying my fear. I didn't even know how to process that, who to reach out to, or what else I might have caused when I had chosen my own comfort over that child in desperate need, the seed of anxiety sprouting into a relentless vine strangling my thoughts. I lost sleep, switched off my phone, and tried to quiet my mind as new pangs of remorse twisted inside. Until finally, the storm decision echoed back, shattering my solitude as I found the resolve to confront my cowardice. I trudged over to her house, the sky heavy with moisture, wind whipping at my clothes. I brought with me just a small bouquet I had cobbled together from my backyard. Upon reaching her home, though, dread built up the moment I caught sight of flashing lights against the windows, the police, their rigid figures silhouetted against the open door, spilling tragedy. A knot in my stomach deepened. I had worse fears about what had happened than I could admit. I stood rooted as I overheard snippets of a conversation. She was in some kind of state. "We'll get him out to safety," and in a shadowed corner of my mind, something thudded sickeningly as the implications crashed over me. I had known. I had known when I felt that chill in my gut, the heaviness of something grotesque awakening after I refused. Then, a small, familiar silhouette collided with my view. Thomas, hair tousled, eyes blurred with tears as he was led away, crying for his mother while the officers inspected his sad little figure. I could see the raw confusion wrapped around his expression like a shroud. I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged, my heart hammering in my chest as it dawned on me. She hadn't gone to the hospital because she needed to, she had been in an irreversible descent that I had just turned my back on, and that refusal now manifested a darkness I never anticipated, a helpless child standing dumbstruck in a storm of his own, and I froze under all the weight of it. The cries of a frightened boy saturated the evening air, buried deeper into a grisly storm of fate that had been intertwined with my choice, suffocating all rationality. A figure emerged, covering Thomas with a blanket, but all I could see were the words echoing back, reverberating inside me relentlessly, "Ida for refusing to look after a child." And in that haunting moment, as I stood paralyzed among the onlookers, I knew the answer clawing at my insides like an uncontained beast, leaving me ash-gray with dread as I began to understand. It was a fight I had already lost. Last summer, my 6-year-old son Max came rushing into the living room, frame brimming with the triumphant energy only a child committed to an idea can muster, announcing he'd decided to get a pet snake, a decision I met with equal parts dread and challenge. Rewind a week, and I had let him watch a documentary about reptiles, telling him all the wonderful things about them, how they're silent, mysterious, and perfectly contained. It seemed harmless at the time until Max's fixation intensified, drowning out everything else until it became a daily ritual. He'd research snakes for hours, holding on to facts about their eating habits and habitat. Their sinister, hypnotic movements made him dream of becoming a snake whisperer. I was the one holding the reins on reality. Snakes create nightmares, don't they? We live in a suburb spattered with kids, and most of them had puppies and kittens. I couldn't imagine the looks I'd get from the other parents if they sporadically encountered my boy frolicking with a long, scaled creature in the yard, or worse, if it escaped into the neighborhood. Thus, I decided to inject some realism into this fantasy. I called a local reptile rescue and arranged a visit. The day arrived, easing my nervousness as I drove to the small facility where scaly creatures sat in enclosure after enclosure, murmuring secrets of the wild. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread, half expecting a Houdini snake to leap from its cage and fly for freedom. But upon entering, Max's eyes reflected nothing but awe. He glided from tank to tank, glued to the glass, scarcely breathing, while I stood off to the side, dread building like a storm cloud. Then it happened, he spotted a black mamba. The staff warned us, they weren't kidding, and it was terrifyingly beautiful, its sleek body glistening in the fluorescent light, an almost hypnotizing sight as it flickered its tongue in and out, tasting the air. One of the workers, noting Max's fascination, leaned in with a guarded seriousness. "You know, they are deadly, right?" I could sense Max's excitement inching toward horror, but instead of pulling him away, I decided to reinforce reality. "See, Max? This is what I mean about snakes. They can seem mesmerizing, but they're also dangerous. No one should have one in the house unless they really know what they're doing." His sparkle dimmed, brows knitted together in confusion and disappointment. "So we can't have one, Dad?" My heart seared at the thought, and unable to meet his determined gaze, I replied, "Absolutely not." Just then, he turned on his heel, storming out of the room, the pent-up resolve of a child shattered with a single blow, and I thought maybe I had overdone it, but I nursed the belief that I did it for his safety, though a creeping guilt began to take root. We arrived home, and the atmosphere shifted, the air felt static, and I saw Max's face harden into a stubborn expression that told me this wasn't over yet. Days turned into a battlefield of tears and tantrums, him pleading for even a small, harmless snake, swearing he would care for it himself if I'd just let it happen. "Don't you trust me?" he'd yell, and my heart splintered as I struggled against an invisible wall growing ever higher. Then came the day that broke me. I remember barely holding together my nerves when Max burst into the kitchen wielding a crumpled sheet of paper he'd drawn upon. "This is me," he shouted, presenting a crude, bright crayon drawing that depicted him with a snake coiling around his tiny waist, a face devoid of fear, its smile matching his own. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just art, it was his way of coping, of becoming the snake charmer he thought he could be, and suddenly, in the moment of false triumph, the room felt too small. My breath caught as I realized how desperately he wanted to connect, turning a simple pet into a bridge to something bigger. "Mom and I have talked about it. Just trust me, Dad, I'll be gentle," he insisted, but I was rigid, turning his innocent plea into a fortress of rejection. "Max, it doesn't matter. I won't let you get hurt," I snapped, and there it was, the crushing realization hit me. In protecting him, I was breaking him, and the tears rolled down his cheeks, the paper falling like a forgotten dream as he staggered back. It rumbled, guilt rolled in waves through my head as I saw him flee, a small silhouette against bright walls, and seconds later, I heard the door slam behind him. I found him curled up in the corner of his room, sobbing softly into his pillow, and at that moment, every rationalization melted away. I wanted to apologize but felt locked in, trapped by my decision and the fear of looming judgment from everyone around me, including myself. We are parents, aren't we? We bear the weight of our children's pain and dreams, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I went to give him a hug, but he recoiled, wiped his face angrily, and spat, "Just leave me alone. You don't care about me." Over the next few days, that wretched guilt clung to me like a shadow, pushing my thoughts into darker corners. I tried to engage him in other activities, to erase the memory of that day, but he wouldn't have it. He'd draw more pictures, always involving the same snake, and I'd push it down, push it aside. Until one evening, while sorting through the junk, I stumbled across my college roommate's journal filled with ramblings about folklore and mysticism surrounding animals thought possessed by spirits. I got lost in dark avenues and old stories and discovered something I hadn't thought of in years, a legend about snakes and the children that could speak to them as if they shared a bond of telepathy. My heart raced as I wrestled with thoughts, and that night I couldn't sleep. I dreamt, or rather, I was haunted by Max, and in my dream, he stood with a snake wrapped around his body, looking at me with those big, watery eyes. "Dad, you let it take me," he said, his voice a fragile echo reverberating through the unmistakable serpentine coil. I woke with a start, panting and drenched in horror, an involuntary promise forming on my lips that I would fix this. I needed to make amends before it settled into something irreparable. I knew then that I had to find a way to show Max I believed in him. I mustered every ounce of will and landed on an idea. After all, he wouldn't let the snake slip from his soul, and I had no choice but to let him learn. So, weeks later, with trembling hands and a racing heart, I returned to that facility, but this time apprehensive hope guided my steps. I explained to the same employee about my son's growth, his unwavering passion, and an idea sparked. "Maybe you can help teach him," I ventured, "so that I can see him grow without fear." And I swear, the generous smile from the employee felt like a key. Maybe this wouldn't destroy my child but nurture a fierce respect instead. That weekend, I set everything up, asking Max to join me at the facility to unveil my decision. When I saw him, the wall of anger dissipated, and I whispered, "I found out we're getting you lessons with a trainer," and for a moment, pure astonishment lit up his face. The floodgates burst open as he threw his arms around me, sobbing with gratitude, releasing so much pent-up tension and fear. It felt like heavy weights slipping off my chest, and for the first time, we were back to where we belonged, but then came the creaking feeling of dread. A small, yet haunting voice within reminded me of how close it had come to breaking, and as Max reported how excited he was to learn proper handling, I imagined how close we'd been to losing everything. In the weeks that followed, I often observed Max in the lessons, seeing him step into an understanding that wasn't dictated by fear but by love and respect for the creatures that might seem unimaginable to parents like me. Yet, unease lurked in the air. That gnawing feeling grew as though the snake knew secrets we weren't privy to, and one night as I tucked Max into bed, I caught a glimpse of his crayon drawing sitting atop the bedside table, the snake at its center, smiling, almost sentient as if it held power over our world. A chill coiled around my spine as if it was vital to something far greater than us, and as I left his room, I couldn't help but wonder if there was truth behind the idea that some bonds, like love for those serpents, could also hold dangerous potential. I know this sounds ridiculous, but I need to tell you all about the night I realized how terrifying a seemingly ordinary family dinner could be. It all started when my youngest daughter, Lily, who's a bright, sassy 9-year-old, casually dropped a comment about her older sister, Nina, who's 16 and still single, during our meal. Now, I'm the kind of dad who believes in honesty, so when Lily said, maybe Nina is just waiting for a zombie to wake her up from her sleep, like in those awful romance movies, I chuckled nervously, hoping to diffuse any tension before it escalated. But Nina's face darkened in an instant, her eyes narrowing as if Lily's innocent jab was a personal attack, and that's when I noticed a flicker of something strange behind Nina's usually bright demeanor. It was as if a shadow passed over her, and for a brief moment, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I could see the tension rising, and trying to lighten the mood, I said, "Well, honey, maybe your prince just hasn't found you yet." But that only made things worse as Lily shrugged defiantly. "The last prince never cared for anyone in the kingdom, he disappeared when he was supposed to show up." That's why he's not here now. I could almost feel the atmosphere shift, thickening around us like fog, as Nina's silence grew heavy and deafening. It was at that moment that my wife, Sarah, who had been silent all evening, suddenly snapped her head toward Nina and asked, "What's wrong with waiting, sweetie? Not everyone finds their person right away." For a split second, I thought Nina would say something dismissive, but instead, she leaned forward, her voice a mere whisper, as though sharing a secret. "It's not the waiting that scares me, Mom. It's the fear of waiting too long, of becoming invisible," her fingers trembling as she toyed with a loose thread on her sweater. With every word, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The sight of my little girl unraveling was a nightmare I never wished to witness, yet here we were, spiraling deeper into an unexpected darkness, with Lily oblivious to the storm brewing around her. As the conversation swayed back and forth, I noticed a flicker behind Nina's gaze, a kind of desperation that made me question what had been brewing beneath the surface. When Sarah attempted to steer the topic toward Lily's soccer practice, something in Nina snapped. She shot back, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "What if I don't want ordinary? What if I want something bigger than this boring life? Maybe I don't want to be a princess. Maybe I want to be left alone." I hesitated, torn between defending my daughters and probing for deeper truths, but the air had grown too tense for exploration. It felt like one wrong word could unleash chaos, and the primal instinct to protect surged through me, so I awkwardly stood before them, the silence fracturing like glass. My heart raced, wondering why simple family banter had morphed into emotional warfare so quickly. Because I had seen my children argue before, but never like this, never, with a palpable weight of sadness shadowing every picture-perfect meal shared. Then came the moment that set my nerves ablaze. Nina, choked with emotion, dashed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her, leaving only Lily, who blinked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, asking, "Did I do something wrong, Dad?" As I opened my mouth to reassure her, the sound of Nina's laughter drifted back through the hallway, but it was unlike any laugh I'd heard. It held an eerie edge that felt out of place in our home. A sickening realization dawned on me. There was a sinister overtone lurking in the shadows of what we had just witnessed, and without a clue to what sparked such resentment from my eldest. Immediately, I rushed after Nina, the chill clinging to my skin as I reached her room, only to find her door locked tight. I knocked gently, but she answered with silence thick enough to drown in. "Nina, sweetie, I'm worried. Can we talk?" And her response surprised me. "Can we talk about nothing, Dad? Because that's all this family does." Confusion reignited in me as the rattling echo of her words unsettled my mind. Did she feel trapped in our lives, or was it all the teasing about her love life haunting her like a ghost? Just as I was about to force the door open, I recalled the stories Nina had told me about her friends, how they'd all begun dating and sharing secrets, and how she felt out of place in a world that was expanding without her. The thought made my heart ache, but it never warranted this level of isolation and despair. Frantically, I turned to look for Sarah, hoping to make sense of it all, yet she stood at the end of the hall, frozen as if she'd seen a ghost. I glanced into her eyes, and I could see her grappling with emotions of her own, but before she could speak, we heard it, the muffled chanting. My blood ran cold, and I leaned in closer to hear Nina, chanting softly through the door, words flowing like a dark incantation filled with longing and resentment. "I will not be invisible, I will not be ordinary, I will rise above this life and claim what belongs to me." The chilling promise sent shivers crawling down my spine. Those were words I wouldn't let linger in this family, so I pushed the door open with force, but as the hinges creaked in protest, time warped. Whatever had been waiting to pounce felt like it had slipped through a crack, and the room before me was unlike what I remembered. Flickering shadows danced against the walls, twisting and turning with sinister intent, and what stood before me was not the Nina I raised. In her place stood someone or something, a version battling for dominance, eyes gleaming with a malevolence that felt ancient. As I stumbled back, gasping for breath, I grasped for sense, realizing I wasn't just witnessing a fractured family dynamic. I was confronted by something far darker that had fed off our pain. A screech erupted from what resembled my daughter, and I stumbled back as the lights flickered violently, plunging us into a pitch-black void. I could feel the desperate energy within our walls as if the very air thickened with anger and despair, and as I tried to move, a chilling whisper escaped. I realized this wasn't about a family dinner anymore. It was about confronting the monsters that had found their way into our home, perhaps born from secrets and fears we had never dared to voice. And as I prepared to save Nina, I felt the broken shards of our perfect family crumble around me, leaving behind the echo of her chant reverberating through our lives. "I will not be ordinary. When I first met Aaron, his odd habit of sitting on the stairs struck me as endearing, a quirk that added charm to his otherwise grounded personality, but after 3 years of marriage, what I initially found whimsical became a chilling source of contention. Every evening like clockwork, perched against the staircase railing, he would sit staring into the shadows cast by the dim hallway light as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I shrugged it off as a simple idiosyncrasy. We all have our routines, right? Yet, the deeper I delved into his unyielding descent into this strange fixation, the more I realized I was slipping down the rabbit hole with him. Friends raised eyebrows during dinner parties when Aaron spontaneously excused himself for stare time, and I found myself defending him when they laughed and made comments like, "Is he trying to catch ghosts?" My own laughter had faltered awkwardly, but dismissing the behavior outright felt wrong. In my heart, I could feel something lurking in the back of my mind, that unsettling chill that crawled down my spine, whispering that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I first started questioning his fixation as more than just harmless silliness. The lightning struck so close that the glass in our windows rattled, and the power flickered, plunging us into darkness. I stumbled to find my flashlight, but as I neared the staircase, a strange sound drifted from Aaron's post, a low, hypnotic hum, flowing like water over stones. My heart raced as I shone the beam toward him, but he appeared blissfully ignorant of my presence, completely entranced. Just then, the hum morphed into words, taunting me, whispering my name with an unsettling familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to reach for him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unwilling to break the spell. "Aaron?" I finally squeaked. He blinked, his gaze coming into focus, and the look of pure confusion on his face was like a shard of glass slicing through my chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. After stumbling over my words, I told him about the humming, but he shrugged it off as a trick of the storm. The next day, I decided to do some digging, researching stare sitting online, and my stomach fell. It was a bizarre phenomenon some called positional meditation, with connections to cult-like practices, which began painting a sinister picture in my mind. I thought of confronting him but was paralyzed by fear. What if the quiet surrender to the shadows was a sign of something darker, a part of him I didn't know? Days turned into weeks, and the frequency of his stare sitting escalated. Sometimes I could hear him murmuring, having conversations in a language I didn't recognize, while I became a ghost in our own home, hovering in the kitchens and bedrooms filled with toxic dread. One evening, desperation got the best of me, and I staked out in the hallway to confront him. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, when I finally summoned the courage and confronted him, demanding he quit the odd ritual. But when I reached out, suddenly my world disintegrated as the air crackled around us. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before, fear mixed with exhilaration. "They are waiting for me. The sound calls." I felt ice twisting in my stomach. There it was, the singular rift between us, with me standing firmly on one side, desperately trying to pull him back from whatever abyss he tumbled into. Panic washed over me, and I insisted we needed help, but Aaron only tightened his grip on the banister, eyes glistening as though he were torn, an entire universe breaking apart behind them. That was when the strange noises began. Every night after he started spiraling, the walls creaked and groaned, shadows flickered just out of view, like they were sneering at our fragile existence. I debated whether I should call someone or wake him, but then I hesitated and drowned in silence. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, terrified to wander near the stairs lest I catch a glimpse of whatever ethereal thing had captivated him. Then one night, just when I thought I could accept our new distorted reality, I awoke to find Aaron standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the blackness, taking on an almost ghostly posture, unblinkingly fixated on the top step, where a pale, flickering light began to materialize. My voice croaked as I called out, demanding to know what he could see, but he merely responded, "They're here now, they've come for me." Time shattered. I felt my heart racing in an overwhelming urge to flee. The very shadows that had once draped our home now felt like living entities, swirling and beckoning. In a moment of extreme desperation and instinct, I lunged and grabbed him, pulling him away from the bottom step, terrified of the fate he was so eagerly embracing. The light winked out with a pop, and he turned to me, rage and confusion flaring in his eyes before something in them dimmed, and he finally seemed to break free from whatever enchantment had gripped him. "What did you do?" he murmured, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. I took a step back, horrified yet relieved, realizing I had yanked him back from some tongue-in-cheek path that offered nothing but despair. We spent that night talking. I tried explaining the sounds, the way he'd been acting, the horror clawing through my mind. He listened, nodding slowly, but it felt like trying to stitch a gaping wound closed with nothing but threads of silence. He promised to stop sitting on the stairs, but the truth was, he didn't. He just did it when I wasn't home, and what was even worse? It didn't seem to bother him, a secret pathway he had invisibly carved for himself. The creaking of the stairs became my worst nightmare, a haunting reminder that something darker was tangled in the very fabric of our lives, gnawing at the edges of our reality. A few weeks later, I received a message from a friend who had seen a post on a local forum. It was about stair sitting, but this time the tone shifted towards something darker. Someone related their own experience, detailing people who had disappeared after embracing the dark rituals surrounding stair sitting. My heart crumpled as I understood too well that each tale resonated painfully with our own. I couldn't bear to think that Aaron was edging toward that fate, and that's when I realized it was no longer a simple quirk, it was a siren call to his very essence. One night, I confronted him yet again, my voice trembling as I pleaded for him to talk to me, to let me help him break free from this malevolent pull. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over as he muttered about how the connection was irreplaceable, his lips curling into a smile that made my skin crawl. In the pit of my stomach, I felt doom approaching, the shadows were gathering once again, a thick black fog creeping closer, and I didn't know if I could save him before it was too late. Things escalated into madness. Every time I caught him sitting, whispers would crawl through the house like a sinister echo, and I grew more frantic. I searched for solutions, scoured the web for anything that might help. Most advice seemed like a vague, foggy guide that only intensified the fear of my helplessness, but I stumbled upon a last resort suggestion, a ritual to confront what he now called the calling. I knew it could just as easily backfire, but if it meant saving him, I had to try. The night of the ritual came, and our home pulsed with an ominous energy as I set everything up, the air thick as I placed candles around us, trembling as I prepared to expose the heart of the problem once and for all. I asked him to sit on the stairs, to summon whatever dark force had wrapped itself around him, and for a moment, it appeared as if he was being pulled back into that strange trance as I followed behind, holding tightly to the love I had for him like a shield. When he closed his eyes and the shadows swirled, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, drawing us both in, and my mind was racing as I fought against the tangible hold they had on him. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but I pushed through. I cried out, begging for him to focus on me. Don't you see? They want you, but you're more than this. The energy shifted, rippling through the air, and I prayed for clarity, for him to break free from whatever malevolent grip was pulling him. For an agonizing moment, it looked as if he might not return, that the shadows would swallow him whole, but in a rush of courage, I wrapped my arms around his waist. It was a surge of feral determination that pulled him back to me, and he jolted awake, gasping as the dark whispers faded into silence. We fell back onto the floor, panting heavily. "I won't let you go," I cried, holding him tightly, as though I could sew his very essence back together. I thought we would be safe now, that the dark merely needed to be confronted, but a sudden realization crashed over me like thunder. Aaron's grin had shifted from a mere twisted amusement to something far more sinister. He whispered into my ear, "They're still here." The air turned cold, and even as I felt hope bloom in my chest, the shadows flickered back to life, thickening around us, absorbing my disbelief as they reached for my husband, my love, threatening to unravel every shred of light I still harbored. Now as I sit here, heart racing and hands trembling, I can't help but wonder if in my desperate attempts to save him, in defending against that haunting ritual, I've only placed myself within reach of the darkness too. Ida, for defending my husband's stair-sitting habits? I think I already know the answer, and I'm terrified of what it may mean for the both of us. I never thought a simple time test could spiral into a living nightmare, but here we are, and I need to share what happened before it consumes me entirely. My husband, Aaron, has always been my biggest supporter, or at least that's what I believed until last week. With finals approaching, I dedicated a Saturday to prepare for my final exam, the kind worth a significant chunk of my grade. I set up in our small bedroom, a dimly lit space that was usually filled with warmth but felt claustrophobic under the pressure of looming deadlines. I had placed my phone on Do Not Disturb, drowning out the world, steeling my will against distractions, and I was well into a practice test when I heard the faint creaking of the door. I wasn't sure whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or a genuine sound breaking my concentration. I told myself I was just imagining it and pressed ahead. The clock was ticking. I could feel my heart rate sinking with its relentless countdown. Just as I reached a particularly tricky question, the door swung open wider than expected, and there stood Aaron, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't knock. He didn't even wait for me to acknowledge him. He simply walked in and, without a word, grabbed the empty coffee cup from my cluttered desk, which wouldn't have been a big deal under normal circumstances, but in that moment, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. I exploded, shouting for him to get out and that I was in the middle of an important test. The look on his face morphed into confusion and hurt, making me feel worse almost instantly, yet a primal anger surged in me, an instinctive need to protect my focus at all costs, and I didn't realize I had crossed a line. Aaron backed away as if struck, retreating without another word, and I immediately regretted my outburst. It was never my intention to hurt him, but in the throes of tension, I was blind to everything else. Shaking, I tried to refocus, but the heaviness of my guilt loomed larger than any countdown timer. When I finally returned to the living room post-test, my heart sank deeper. The usually vibrant space felt hollow, too quiet, with tension hanging thick in the air. "Aaron?" I called hesitantly, my voice a small echo against the silence. No answer. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and then the spare room, but each corner of our home held only emptiness. Panic tightened my throat as I grabbed my phone, ready to text him, but just as I was about to fire off a message, I noticed my notifications lighting up. The group chat with my classmates was flooded with frantic messages. "Did you hear about Aaron? I can't believe it, they were right near the corner." And then the most chilling of them all, they said his car is gone. My heart dropped as a gnawing realization settled in. They were talking about the car accident in the news, and my mind raced with desperate images of a twisted metal heap, my husband a possible victim, consequences of his day spiraling out of control for reasons I couldn't fathom. I raced to the living room TV, where a breaking news segment flickered to life, reporters framed by flashing lights, and there was Aaron's car smashed against a tree, completely unrecognizable. They were saying something about speed, a reckless driver, and I felt the world around me shatter anew with every word. Somehow, I remained stuck in my own head, trapped between the anger I felt moments earlier and the fear gripping me now, unable to disentangle from the chaos I had already created. It was my fault. I had shut him out during a moment of sheer panic, blinded by my own selfish needs. I dropped to the floor, tears streaming down my face as guilt twisted into a knot in my stomach. What if he didn't make it? What if my voice had been the last thing he heard? I couldn't bear the thought. I grabbed my things and raced out the door, my heart pounding like a war drum against my ribcage as I sped toward the hospital, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. Every red light felt like a ticking clock reminding me that I may have lost the only person who meant anything to me. When I finally made it to the ER, a haze of white coats and muffled voices surrounded me, and I stumbled onto a nurse who stopped me, her face a mask of professionalism that seemed utterly indifferent, and my gut twisted with urgency. "Please, where is he?" The nurse looked down and spoke carefully, almost as if she were preparing to shatter whatever shred of hope re-entered my heart. "You'll need to wait, ma'am. We're doing everything we can." I felt my heart drop into the depths of despair as the minutes turned into hours, each tick of the clock a cruel reminder of my own actions. The waiting area morphed from an ordinary space into a suffocating chamber of dread where guilt gnawed at my insides, replaying our last moments together like a broken record. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared, and my soul practically leapt into my throat. "He's stable," she said cautiously, "but he's unconscious. You can see him, but..." She paused, and the world around me faded out for a moment. "It's serious." The words felt like ice as I walked into the stark hospital room, seeing Aaron there, hooked to machines, wires snaking around him, face bruised and battered. Reality collided with my trauma, crashing into me with violent force. I approached the bed, heart heavy with emotion, wishing I could take back everything, shouting, turning away. I gently took his hand, squeezing it tightly as if my life depended on it. "I'm so sorry, Aaron. I never wanted this. I had no idea how much I needed you until I almost lost you." Tears continued to flow freely as I sat there, whispering to him, pouring out all the love and regret that had built up inside me. As days turned into a week, the fragile threads of hope began to weave through the darkness, and Aaron slowly started to regain consciousness. The first time his eyes fluttered open, dread coursed through me. What would he say? Would he hate me? I couldn't face that possibility. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't remember the fight, praying my words had reached him somehow. He turned his head slightly, squinting at the harsh fluorescent lights before his gaze fell on me, bewilderment etched across his face. What happened? He managed to croak, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief mixed with dread as I prepared to answer. This moment felt pivotal, but in his eyes, I saw forgiveness, possibly a reflection of my own guilt. Maybe he could sense the crushing weight of my regret, or maybe it was just the haze of pain killing every harsh thought. All I could do was nod and squeeze his hand tighter, letting the tears flow. You got into an accident, I said softly. You're here now. Just focus on getting better. We had a long road ahead of us, and in that uncertain future lay the lessons of a nightmarish reality, one that had shaken our lives and reminded me of the fragility of every moment we take for granted. It's wild how quickly everything can change, how a simple act of frustration in an innocent moment can lead us to the brink before bringing us back in character-shattering ways. It was in those darkest hours that I realized it was never about the test, but rather the love and understanding we have to nurture. Life is too unpredictable. I vowed never to take him for granted again. So, am I the asshole for shouting at him during a time test? I'm not sure if that label matters anymore. I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all-too-familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: if you can't make it on time, don't come at all. When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student, but I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. Just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun, yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master, realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. I wasn't the kind of guy who went around crushing the dreams of 7-year-olds, but something about my girlfriend's brother, Timmy, always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he puffed out his chest as if he were a king while wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, or the fact that he made me play against him in video games every single time I came over because he was convinced he could beat me if I just dared to try. I used to let him win, sure, I'd play a little harder than normal, but I figured it built his confidence. Timmy was a sweet kid otherwise, always the first to offer me a cookie from his stash or show me his favorite toy, but there was something almost sinister beneath the surface of that small, innocent face. It was his relentless whining every time I beat him, the way he would stomp his foot and demand I go again, claiming I was cheating as if I were some kind of adult monster trying to ruin his childhood. I tried to laugh it off. I didn't want to diminish a kid's spirit, but when he kept taunting me about how I was never going to beat him at anything ever, I felt that familiar itch to prove a point. It was a calm Saturday evening when I finally snapped. My girlfriend was baking cookies in the other room, and the sweet, chocolatey smell wafted through the air, mixing with Timmy's cries of frustration as I scored yet another winning point. "You just let me win, didn't you?" he accused, glaring at me with those huge, innocent brown eyes that suddenly didn't seem so innocent, as if the shadows of the dimly lit room were casting a spell that twisted his features into something darker. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as something primal ignited in me, a sudden desire not just to win, but to utterly destroy his confidence right then and there. "No, Timmy, this time it's for real," I said, feeling a surge of energy course through my veins. I wouldn't just let him win, I would crush him, mercilessly. As we picked up the controllers with renewed intensity, I focused my eyes on the screen, which seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the colors flashing brighter as I dove deeper into the game. I performed moves I didn't even know I had inside me, deftly dodging every attack and countering every strategy he tried to pull. With each round I won, I expected Timmy to laugh or challenge me more fiercely, but the glow of the TV reflected in his gaze as he stared in stunned silence at the pixels that represented his rapidly fading hope. I felt exhilarated, but as his face fell, I also felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the house around us was growing colder, the walls whispering tales of the arrogance of pride and the dark side of competition. "I'm not letting you win again, Timmy. This is just how it is, and you need to understand that." The words tasted bitter on my tongue as I said them, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like a cold wave crashing onto the shore of a lonely beach, but I pushed it aside and focused on the screen. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I turned the game into a dominating disaster for him. I perfected the final move, and just as I hit the game's concluding action, the room was engulfed in darkness. The TV flickered and died, plunging us into an eerie silence, the only sound being the added stream of my own heavy breathing, and I felt every ounce of joy drain from the atmosphere as Timmy sat there trembling, his small hands clenched into fists that shook like leaves caught in a violent storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a whisper as though he was terrified of the answer. I started to reply, but that was when I noticed the lights in the house flickering strangely, almost rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in a language only the children of nightmares could understand. The shadows lengthened, extending across the walls like spectral fingers grasping for something they shouldn't have, and in that moment, I realized that the darkness had not merely consumed the television but had troubled the very foundation of our reality. Timmy's laughter turned into a wheeze as he backed away from me, terror dancing in his features, and I don't know what compelled me from that point on, but I instinctively moved toward him, wanting to make him feel safe, wanting him to understand that I was still in control. When my hand brushed against his shoulder, the air turned heavy, the atmosphere thick with something sinister, something that had been lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for just this moment to reveal itself. I thought I heard whispers, distant and haunting, echoing within my mind, and they sounded alarmingly like Timmy's voice as he gasped and said, "I just wanted to win." And I couldn't help but laugh, a short, nervous chuckle that caught deep in my throat, because it suddenly became clear that this was about more than just winning a game. This had become a matter of life and death. Then he ran. Timmy bolted for the door, screaming his lungs out, but the house felt like it closed in around me, the walls twisting and folding until I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Shadows crawled along the floor like spiders, wrapping their clammy fingers around my ankles as I stumbled forward, trying to follow him, but it was as if the house didn't want me to leave. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and there stood Timmy, wide-eyed, as if he had just caught a glimpse of something unspeakably horrifying. Blood drained from my face as dread settled in my stomach. Whatever demon had stirred inside that game was now writhing between us, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Are you mad?" he stammered as fear carved lines into his innocent face, and just when I thought I'd backed myself into a corner from which I could never escape, I heard it, an echo of laughter, warped and malevolent, that seemed to seep from the very walls, shaking them with sinister intent. That's when I knew, I had irrevocably broken something inside Timmy, something precious and innocent, and whatever darkness had awakened in that moment was now straining to escape. In that split second, I realized that I wasn't just facing the consequences of my cruel decision, I had unleashed something terrifying, a cruel shadow cast by my own hubris. A cold shiver snaked its way down my spine, as I whispered to Timmy, "I didn't mean for this to happen," but the words felt hollow and the room echoed back with an unsettling refrain, timid yet filled with a knowing horror. We stared into the face of an inexplicable fear, one that bore no physical form yet demanded to be reckoned with, and as I stood there paralyzed, I could almost feel the world fracturing beneath my feet. Those few seconds stretched long and thin, moments filled with understanding that some lines should never be crossed. I knew I needed to do something, to make amends while I could still grasp reality, but just then, Timmy's laughter resumed, only this time it sounded like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot, a boy's giggle turned cruel, echoing from the shadows that had seeped into the corners of the room. I was caught in a web of my own making, shackled by consequences, trapped in a darkness that bore witness to my mistakes, and I was left wondering if I had indeed become the monster in the children's tale I'd once considered so innocent, the very arbiter of nightmares unleashed upon this world in an unthinking act of pride. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, the kind that felt ripped straight from the pages of a dystopian novel, marred with shades of gray and uncertainty, and the darkness that lurked just out of sight. My daughter, Hannah, has always danced on the edges of life, a brilliant but misunderstood 15-year-old laboring under the weight of what I thought was autism, her unique quirks, the way she'd chatter about dinosaurs to anyone who would listen, her anxiety sudden like whispers in the wind. My heart broke for her in the cruel world of teenagers, and I encouraged her to embrace her differences, to find beauty in her peculiarities. So, when I overheard her mention her autism to her friends in what I thought was a proudly defensive way, a cute little quirk she believed made her special, my gut clenched with an unsettling tightness. Inviting them over for a study session seemed harmless enough, but when I saw the way they wrapped around her, smothering her with assurances, it drove something chaotic and protective in me to burst out. I never meant for it to escalate, but suddenly I was standing in front of them, my voice defeating the friendly laughter and chatter, declaring that she wasn't autistic. The room thickened with discomfort, and I could see Hannah's face twist into the kind of hurt that sends an icy hand straight through a parent's heart, her friends looking between us like toddlers caught in a watered-down horror movie. The air crackled with something unnameable, and I could see it all unravel, how I had gotten it wrong, or maybe the world had twisted it, maybe I was condemning her to confusion, gaslighting her to fit my expectations, but each word tumbled out of my mouth against the creeping, gnawing terror misfiring in my brain. What if I was wrong? My daughter shrank into herself, her friends standing like frozen statues as I mentally backpedaled, desperately searching for words that could unring the bell of my rash outburst. I tried to explain, autism had never been verified, we had gone through evaluations, and I thought we were just on the edge of understanding her better. I pleaded with the space to breathe again, yet Hannah had already darted past me, eyes filled with something frighteningly close to betrayal, into the upturned laughter of her friends. I could hear the mumbles beneath the laughter, she can't even own her truth, maybe she is just weird, and the guilt sank in deeper than any regret I'd ever felt. Was I trying to protect her from the label, or was I just afraid of what that label might mean for me? As I stood there with my words hanging like a noose, I could feel the dread creep in like a fog, thickening with every second as I recalled darker days, missing the boundary of her laughter where I thought she was comfortable with her identity. I tried to grasp for a semblance of control over the chaos spinning into reality. Panic bubbled in my throat. I wanted to run after her, hold her, explain that I'd love her no matter what, but my phone buzzing in my pocket reminded me there are always consequences to every action. The school counselor calling, each ring a reminder piercing through me. If only I had the words that day, maybe she wouldn't have bolted outside, and maybe the shadows I feared wouldn't have been stirred up at all. The call didn't land fortuitously, it landed like a slap, announcing a meeting that I was supposed to attend to address the teacher's concerns about the transition Hannah was undergoing, entering high school, and the interactions it birthed. I paced the dim hall of our home, anxiety wrapping around my thoughts like a chokehold. I knew what they were going to say, potential loss of funding for her IEP, the looming sense of suspicion that somehow, I was mishandling this brilliant, fragile creature. Hours passed, and dread infused my silence, until finally, I heard her voice wavering outside, moments before her friends were to leave, their chatter growing distant, and then silence settled like a stone. I couldn't bear the thought of facing her unprepared, my mind a storm, the aftermath of my reckless act sitting between us. I walked tentatively to her room, where the door lay ajar, shadows dancing eerily under the flickering light of her desk lamp. She was sitting against her wall, tablet in hand, lost in the glare of the screen, a world far removed from me. "You don't understand anything," she shouted when the door creaked open, resentment wrapped around her words so tightly I felt it brush against my skin. You just want to fit me in a box." I tried to engage her, to tell her what I felt in the pit of my heart, that I was trying to protect her, to shield her from a world that could be unnervingly cruel. But words only poured out, like tongues of fire, igniting our conversation into a full-blown war of truths, half-truths, and fear, all wrapped around the question that haunted us, Ida for trying to define her existence based on something I had convinced myself to believe was in her best interest. As I listened to her cry, feeling that empty sentiment seeping into every crack of my resolve, I realized it wasn't merely the labels but the isolation we both hungered to escape. We were spiraling into a chasm, too deep for either of us to grab hold of the edge. Time blurred until it felt distorted, like watching a movie play out on a wall with others looking in, and in those frantic minutes, I lost sight of how to untangle the lie I'd created over fear, how to repair a fracture that threatened to turn my sweet daughter into someone unrecognizable. Our truths collided violently, and despair coiled tight around my chest until clarity hit harder than any revelation I had ever known. The only way out of this was through her, through listening and understanding, no matter how terrifying that felt, no matter the shockwaves that would ripple through my own perception of her identity. So I knelt on the floor beside her, fingers trembling like my resolve, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Hannah. I want to understand you. I want you to know you're perfect just the way you are, no labels, just you. Please help me." But even as I said those words, I could feel shadows swirling in the corners of my mind. What if the thing I feared most had already begun to deposit itself into the very fabric of our lives? What if this small fracture between us was just the start of something darker to come? As peripheries blurred and fear turned to ice, loneliness stretched unrelentingly, and I held my breath, hoping that this time, it would heal rather than destroy us. Ida for not inviting my nephew on vacation? It started as a simple family trip to a cabin in the woods, a chance for my kids to unwind before school started again, but everything changed when my sister's son, Jamie, was mentioned. I hadn't seen him in a while. His mother, Sarah, had become reclusive since her divorce, her walls tightening around her like a fortress. The last time we were together, Jamie was a sweet, albeit awkward, 12-year-old. You'd think his 16th birthday would have matured him, but he felt different somehow, more distant and brooding. Sarah texted me a week before we left, pleading me to take him. He needs family, she wrote, her words laced with desperation. I hesitated. Jamie had started to linger around the edges of social media, posting pictures that hinted at a fascination with dark themes, and I've always been the protective type, especially when it concerns my kids. Just days before the trip, I finally responded, "He can stay with you, we're looking for a low-key vacation." I thought that would be the end of it. But on the day we left, I caught my sister's expression when she saw my kids loaded into the car, a mix of hope and dread that twisted something inside me. They waved goodbye, and Jamie's eyes, oh God, those eyes, held such a haunting intensity, a storm of emotions boiling just beneath the surface. I could barely sleep in the cabin, the walls creaked unnervingly at night, and I kept hearing whispers, low and slithering like a snake through the air, but I tried to shake it off, just the house settling, I told myself. On the second evening, while the kids roasted marshmallows outside, I found an old scrapbook tucked beneath one of the beds in our room. The pages were yellowed and curling, filled with grainy photographs of children. I flipped through and my stomach dropped at the sight. Jamie was in some of them, looking eerily out of place, and the other kids, they looked off, like something dark was seeping from their smiles, their eyes too hollow. My headache worsened, shadows seemed to twist into figures in the periphery, and I could have sworn I heard breathing whenever I turned my back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had known something before she packed Jamie off. That night, my children were restless, they tossed and turned, sleep eluding them, and at one point, my youngest, Lily, woke me up, wide-eyed and terrified, whispering of a man in the woods who stared at her from behind the trees. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an imagination lit by the flickering firelight, but I couldn't help but feel an ominous presence lurking beyond our campfire. The following day, I decided to take a hike with the kids to dispel the uneasy feeling hanging over us. As we wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed a tree carved with strange symbols, things that twisted my stomach and made my heart race, symbols that hinted at something ritualistic, dark. Lily, transfixed, wanted to touch the bark, but I pulled her away just in time, the feeling of dread coiling tighter around my mind. That evening, the message came through. Sarah was frantic, texting me nonstop, telling me Jamie had gone missing. My heart dropped, panic crashing over me. I quickly attempted to reassure her. Of course we hadn't invited him to the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was more involved in the panic than I realized. Something whispered that we were wrong to leave him behind. The next few days blurred, another night passed, and I heard scratching at the walls, voices calling to me and childlike laughter, and when I stepped outside, I was hit by an unbearable chill. The woods felt alive, breathing, twisting in ways nature shouldn't, a cacophony of whispers beckoning me, saying come play with us. On the fourth day, the atmosphere shifted entirely. My kids began acting differently, more aggressive, thick-lipped smiles stretching beyond the realm of normalcy, their eyes bearing an unnatural light that chilled my spine. "Where's Jamie?" they asked over and over, speaking of him as if he had always been with them. I felt sweat pooling at the base of my neck. I tried to wrangle them away from the shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing hour, and finally, I gathered the courage to venture deeper into the forest alone, driven by an instinct to find Jamie. As I stepped through the trees, whispers became a chorus, begging me to stay, luring me deeper until I stumbled upon a clearing. There, in the center, was a figure dressed in dark clothes, a silhouette of Jamie, but he looked older, almost feral, eyes shrouded in shadow, the edge of his smile vivid against hollow cheeks. My breath hitched as he turned, revealing teeth sharp as knives and an unnatural grin far too wide for his face. "I've been waiting for you," he hissed, his voice crawling beneath my skin, splintering the quiet like thunder. The shadows danced around him, and as they flickered, I felt a wrenching pull inside of me, and as if the woods had conspired, my kids burst into the clearing, eyes glowing, voices harmonizing with Jamie's as they called me to join them. Then came the sound, like a collective heartbeat, an echo of every kid that ever disappeared in those woods. I turned to run, but the shadows wrapped around my legs, their laughter curling around me, pulling me into their realm. And just as I felt myself slipping into the abyss, a sudden thought shattered through the haze: Ida for not inviting my nephew on vacation. As that realization hit, this strange bond washed over me. I knew that in denying his invited presence, I had awakened something that should have remained dormant. I stumbled back, gasping, pushing against the tangible dark that swirled around me until I finally broke free, tumbling back toward the safety of our cabin, heart racing, mind screaming. I shut the door, locking it tight, a desperate barricade against the voices. I ordered my children to get their things. We're leaving. I didn't care what they thought. I glanced back at the woods, Jamie standing at the edge, a devilish allure flickering in his darkened figure, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel his gaze burning into my back, burning with the knowledge that every year my sister kept him from us, every vacation we had without him, every time we let the shadows whisper, I was sealing not just my fate, but his legacy, a legacy rising from the depths of the forest where children disappear without a trace, where families fall captive, and in that darkness, a voice would always echo, a question reverberating in the silence. Ida for not inviting my nephew on vacation. I hesitated before hitting the send button, my phone trembling in my sweaty palm as I stared at the message I wrote to my aunt, the woman who had been the thorn in my side for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of relative who offered unsolicited advice and criticized every aspect of my life, from my choice of career to my wardrobe, but when she insisted on coming to my house for my birthday dinner, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was supposed to be a day for celebration, a day to enjoy with my friends and family, and instead, the evening turned into a twisted family therapy session where I was dissected like a frog in biology class, her sharp tongue skewering my self-esteem. After an hour of her cutting remarks, I snapped, my patience evaporating like water on a hot day, and I blurted out, "I'll never be good enough for you, will I?" All her laughter and condescension stopped, replaced with an icy silence, and for a moment, I reveled in the satisfaction that came from bringing her down a peg. However, that satisfaction was fleeting and morphed into a sick dread when her expression shifted into something unreadable, as if she had just discovered a hidden truth that had lain dormant for years. The silence stretched heavily between us, wrapping the entire room in a smothering shroud, and when my best friend, Mark, attempted to lighten the mood with a joke, laughter just seemed to echo awkwardly around the table, hardly concealing the tension. My aunt finally spoke, her voice low and slow, like molasses oozing out of a jar. "You should really go to your room, dear," she said, and I let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking, but her eyes glinted with a mixture of anger and something else that sent a shiver down my spine. I could practically feel the echoes of my words hanging in the air, thick and cloying, as I excused myself and retreated to my room, the walls creeping closer as if they were eavesdropping. It was hours before I heard the sounds of the dinner party winding down, loud chatter interspersed with laughter from Mark that felt far away, an island of normalcy in a sea of dread, but even the laughter couldn't drown out the gnawing in my gut that told me I had crossed a line. When the door creaked open, it was my mother standing there, her face pale. "Your aunt wants to talk to you," she said quietly, and I could see the worry etched on her features. I moved reluctantly, every step weighed down with foreboding until I stepped into the living room, where my aunt sat stiffly on the edge of the couch as if she were so wound up that she might snap. I could feel my heart race, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay, my eyes glued to her, and then she leaned forward, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for our family, do you?" I opened my mouth to protest, to ground her words in some semblance of reality, but I was struck dumb by the raw intensity in her gaze. It was as if she were peering into my soul, dissecting all my hidden insecurities, and in a volcanic eruption of emotions that I couldn't control, she admitted something I never saw coming. Her upbringing had been a nightmare. The house was filled with whispers and shadows of unspoken things, and I had been too naive to notice. For what felt like hours, she unraveled the threads of her own pain, stories of family betrayals and lost loves, everything meeting the gnashing of teeth and the silent screams of the night. I wanted to comfort her, but the more she spoke, the more disoriented I became, ideas of comfort clashing with the venomous way she treated me, and in this warped tapestry of her life, I saw reflection, not just of herself, but a reflection of how she viewed me, as a failure with no hope in her eyes. When she finally fell silent, I stood frozen, the weight of this revelation heavy on my chest as I struggled to find the words to fill the void that had opened between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but there was something fractured in her expression. She gazed at me with an intensity I couldn't fathom, and just below the surface, I sensed her disappointment, a flicker of pain that ignited into a wildfire. She leaned closer, seemingly brimming with a need to impart her final lesson. You must understand, it's not about being good enough, it's about survival. Life is unforgiving, and if you can't understand that, then you have no hope. At that moment, I felt a shiver ripple across my spine. It felt like a threat wrapped in wisdom, a chilling portent of what awaited me beyond the confines of this moment. My pulse quickened, and as I stumbled backward, I could feel that same creeping sensation that had haunted me since I was a child. I turned and fled upstairs, shutting the door behind me, pushing my back against it as if barricading myself against her presence. But the moment I felt safe, the shadows in my room shifted, flickering like candlelight, and I whimpered at the encroaching darkness. It wasn't until later, curled under my soft blanket, that I heard the muffled echoes of conversation between my mother and my aunt downstairs, their voices entwined like two serpents fighting for dominance, until I finally embarked on the road to sleep, where night after night, my dreams morphed into nightmares, my aunt's words haunting me like a sinister refrain, repeating over and over until they carved grooves into my mind, sometimes morphing her face into something monstrous that loomed over me. Days bled into weeks, and while my aunt eventually left, the tension never quite dissipated. I found myself looking over my shoulder as if at any moment her icy presence would return to taunt me, the weight of our conversation still thick and oppressive, suffocating the air around me, and then the dreams grew darker, twisting into something grotesque, her voice echoing with the laughter of children, mocking me while I went untouched, trapped in a glass box that no one else could see, and during those nights, I found myself screaming for my mom, reaching for the warmth of the real world, but she couldn't hear me. I started to notice subtle shifts too, small things like objects moving in my periphery, shadows stretching in ways that defied reason, and an uneasiness burrowing itself in my bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. That sense of dread culminated on a particularly stormy night when a crack of thunder shook my room awake and I looked up to see someone standing in the shadows, the silhouette barely detectable in the darkness, but just as I was about to convince myself it was a trick of the light, I recognized the warm outline of my aunt, her expression twisted into something terrible, smiling cruelly, a manifestation of my own fears given flesh, and in that instant, I finally understood the words she'd said. They weren't merely warnings or lessons, they were a curse set to ensnare my soul. I bolted up from my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, frantically scrambling for the light switch that ultimately betrayed me by turning on with an unsettling flicker. Yet there was no sign of her. The room was empty but still suffused with that same malignant energy, and I collapsed onto my bed in a heap of raw nerves, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Over the next few weeks, my mental state unraveled. I found myself questioning reality, my own perceptions morphing into a living nightmare, and as the sun filtered through my window, scattering light across my face, it felt like every shadow carried a dagger aimed straight at my heart, until one night, as desperation clawed violently at the edges of my mind, I confronted my mother, voice trembling. I expressed my fears, told her what I had seen, but her face mirrored only disbelief, and that made it worse. She didn't understand. She thought I was merely acting out, a child unwilling to accept the terms of adulthood. It felt as though my words floated into a void, unheard and uncared for, and that's when I realized I had no one to turn to. Weeks became months, my studies suffered, friendships strained, and the isolation consumed me, until one evening when I finally broke down, throwing a glass against the wall, the shards littering my room like fragments of my crumbling sanity. I wished I had been kinder to my aunt, wished I hadn't shouted at her, but wishful thinking morphed into deafening silence as I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to fathom my spiraling demise. Then it hit me, a radical thought that filled me with dread and clarity all at once. What if her curse was digging its claws deeper and deeper with each passing day? My mind was a battlefield of frantic thoughts. Maybe she was right all along. I was destined to be a failure. I could feel it in every shaky breath, every restless night, and one desperate line of hope strung tight in my heart. I needed to confront her, unleash whatever darkness she had thrust upon me. So, without thinking, I dialed her number, each ring like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning, and when she picked up, that familiar sing-song voice filled the air. "Hello, dear." I could hear the sweet undercurrent of condescension wrapping itself around her words, and I steeled myself, daring to confront my fears. "What did you do to me?" I managed to choke out, the words tumbling raw and unhinged, but there was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought I had lost her, and then she laughed, a chilling sound that echoed down my spine like icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. "Oh honey, that was just the beginning," she said, and I realized, right then, what terrible sacrifice she had made. No, not for the family, but to ensure that I would carry the burden of her darkness, a parasite feeding off my mistakes. With every accusation I hurled at her now, I felt smaller, more defeated. She fed off my fear, reshaping it into something twisted and wholly her own, until finally, with one last mocking laugh, she hung up, leaving me holding a phone in a vice grip as silence enveloped me, and just as the last flicker of hope threatened to evaporate, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had been cast aside, but I would be the one who would have to break the cycle, and with that ephemeral thought, everything narrowed into sharp focus. Bursts of determination surging through my veins, she could no longer control me, and while the haunting laughter lingered, a defiant fire ignited in my stomach. Just like the day I stood up for myself with words that chaffed but were necessary, I would unravel her grip, confront every shadow, and refuse to be her puppet anymore. Ida, for what I said to my aunt? Yes, perhaps. But what I'll do next, how I choose to take ownership of my life from here on out? That's the real question, isn't it? It's time to rise from the ashes she left behind. Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escape those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the 3 of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. "He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner," she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey, its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now. I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. When my husband, Josh, died unexpectedly, a part of me shattered, twisting grief and disbelief into a bitter knot that settled heavy in my chest. We had only been married 5 years, but they had been the happiest years of my life. Josh was everything, my best friend, my partner, and the light in my life. Losing him felt like a slow suffocation, a waking nightmare that consumed me as I navigated funeral arrangements and the aftermath of his sudden passing. His mother, Elaine, had always been a complicated figure in our lives. She was supportive yet overbearing, and although Josh struggled with their relationship, I tried to foster peace between them. But after he was gone, that dynamic morphed into something else entirely. When I received the life insurance payout, a staggering 6-figure sum, Elaine immediately insisted that she needed half to cover the funeral costs she'd put on her credit card. I was taken aback. There was no discussion of her covering it or me paying her back later, just a demand as if her procession of grief gave her authority over my choices. I had expected tears, shared memories, and perhaps even a quiet moment where we could both remember Josh, but instead, a dark shadow hung over her eyes while she openly calculated her financial expectations. I remember being at the funeral, standing by his casket, the cool air heavy with an unspoken tension. Elaine had taken charge, orchestrating the details as if it were her final say in a business transaction rather than a memorial, and I can't help but wonder if this was her way of grasping control in a world spiraling out of our hands. With every interaction, her disappointment in me deepened. I wasn't mourning in the way she'd expected, perhaps because, beneath my sorrow, I felt the stirrings of anger that soon flared into resentment. When she demanded I give her money, something in me snapped. "It's not your money to demand, Elaine," I hissed, the words spilling out encased in bitterness. Her face turned ash-white, an expression that danced between disbelief and outrage. I thought about the moments I shared with Josh, the joy we built together, and the memories we created as a couple. It felt wrong to surrender that to her. I finally decided to pay for the memorial and cover the remaining costs with the life insurance money, my own damn money, from a plan we had for our future, when I was now simply trying to navigate without him, in a world that felt cold and hollow. I figured it was my right to choose how to honor him, to be the one who decides where that money went, but that wasn't how Elaine saw it. Over the following weeks, she became more persuasive in her demands, trying to warp my sense of obligation by draping her words in grief. "You don't want to forget Josh, do you? You want to honor him," she would say, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like a threat than kindness. I felt like I was being cornered in an emotional chess game, the pieces tipped in her favor. I watched her weave conversations filled with guilt while describing how hard it was raising Josh alone as a single parent, as if this somehow implied I owed her tribute for his very existence. I couldn't shake the feeling that her grief was more about her than about Joshua as I desperately sought the support of friends and family. Most didn't take my side, they echoed Elaine's logic, making me feel like a villain for wanting to claim what was rightfully mine, especially when they'd hear her sob stories. The nights that followed were filled with anxiety, guilt gnawing under my skin while I replayed those unbearable conversations. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own house, constantly haunted by my inability to bend to her will. One evening, as I was sorting through Josh's things, a muted ping from my phone snatched my attention. It was Elaine, with a photo of the blurred headstone at the cemetery, eerily illuminated by a waxing moon. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is where my only son sleeps, and you're the reason I have to suffer alone." I could feel the walls closing in around me, the pressure rising as I tried to breathe through waves of panic and regret. Who's the real monster here? I thought, and countered my discomfort with a cold resentment. In that moment of blind rage, I decided to take a step farther. If she wanted to make this a game of emotional leverage, I would turn the tables. A few days later, as I watched her elaborate on her grief during family dinners to anyone who would listen, I gathered strength. I made plans to take a trip. I turned the life insurance into an opportunity. I booked a getaway to the mountains where Josh and I had always dreamed of spending a weekend, without a care in the world. It was a sanctuary for healing, and I was desperately clinging to memories of the man I loved. My phone buzzed frantically days before I was supposed to leave. It was Elaine, demanding to know where I was going. "It's none of your business," I retorted. Instead of caving under her barrage of guilt-laden messages, I dug deeper into my anger. I left, erasing the emotional strings Elaine had hoped to bind me with. The mountains embraced me like a lover, and there I found solace. I spent time reflecting on who Josh was, what he wanted, and how much he had fought to keep a distance from his chaotic family dynamics. A week passed in blissful isolation before I returned home to a barrage of voicemail and texts detailing accusations of theft, betrayal, and loss of family. I moved through my own fog of despair, waking nightmares that swirled in my mind as I listened. That's when it hit me. I was at the center of this conflict, one that would not fade away. It culminated one last terrible afternoon when I received a summons in the mailbox addressed in her meticulous handwriting, her betrayal now turned legal. The walls I had hoped to reinforce around my grief began to shake as dread seeped into every corner of my heart. I never intended to stop her from grieving, and I never wanted the insurance money to be the focal point of a battle for something as precious as memory. But looking back now, I recognize that Elaine didn't just want money, she wanted control over the narrative of her son's life, even in death. I am left to contend with the guilt that wraps around me like a shroud, yet, somewhere deep within, I know Josh would want me to find my own peace, and perhaps there's more to life than the pain of losing someone, especially someone who had to be let go, regardless of the bones they left behind. As I share this, I wonder, Ida, for wanting to keep the money that was my lifeline to a man whose life I cherished more than anything? Perhaps it doesn't matter, not anymore. What matters now is confronting the echoes of a love that once lit my way and deciding how best to carry that light forward, alone. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, Ida for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. When my cousin Morgan invited me to her graduation party, I was excited but also apprehensive. She had always been the golden child, and I never really measured up. So when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd actually paid her way through an online diploma mill, a secret she vehemently tried to keep under wraps, I felt compelled to confront her in a way I never had before. As I arrived at the lavishly decorated backyard where Instagram-ready balloons floated like pastel clouds and a makeshift wooden stage awaited the valedictorian speech, I saw Morgan basking in the glow of attention, glamorous in her cap and gown, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, a facade that cracked when I caught her in a whispered conversation with her mother, her eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the dread that shadowed her achievement. The tension spiraled as I witnessed her proudly accepting faux accolades from family members who knew nothing about the truth, their hearts too eager to embrace the lie she had spun, and despite my reservations, I found myself standing closer than I should have, caught in a tide of bitter resentment and the sinking realization that the very fabric of our familial love was woven by deception. When the moment arrived, and the spotlight danced its way to me, I felt a surge of jealousy threaten to overthrow my sanity as I grasped the microphone, and almost involuntarily, I blurted out, "Congratulations, Morgan. But I guess it's not my fault you bought your degree." The gasps were audible, a sharp intake of air that split the warm afternoon like thunder, and Morgan's expression shifted instantly from shock to rage, the kind that transformed her cherubic face into a monstrous reflection of pure betrayal. Struggling to maintain my composure under the onslaught of disdainful glares from shocked relatives, I felt a rush of adrenaline, knowing I had thrown a match into a sea of dry kindling. It was a chaotic flurry of shouting voices and clattering utensils, her mother gasping as if I had slapped her across the face. Morgan lunged at me, fists flying, but I didn't back down. My voice echoed like a battle cry as I shouted back about the years spent on her high horse while I worked hard for every scrap of recognition I ever got. The guests' faces were a grim collage of disappointment and concern as Morgan choked back tears and accused me of ruining her day, insisting that our family's blood and humor had always been worth celebrating, but I stood firm in my accusation, questioning the very essence of her achievement, a hyena's laugh punctuating the tension as I pointed to her stack of ceremony photos where every smile seemed to mock the truth, and in that moment, her mask slipped away entirely, revealing the dread underneath. The argument devolved into an exhibition of dirty laundry dragged through the sunshine, where her past transgressions and insecurities collided with my burdens, creating an intangible fissure between us that I feared could never be mended, all eyes piercing through me with an intensity I had never felt before, until suddenly, an older relative stepped in, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, who claimed to know everything, or at least our family folklore, and in that uncanny silence that followed his boisterous entry, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling weighed down by each lie we had ever entertained. It seemed there were whispers buried beneath the layers of our gatherings, and somehow I had exposed an unseen reality that shook the very roots of our idyllic narratives, and as the evening devolved into something grotesque, I felt the atmosphere shift as Morgan's confidence withered, beaten down by the harsh glare of scrutiny while our relatives circled her like vultures, waiting for her to admit her mistake amidst the chaos I had ignited. Days melted into nights, turning that party into a cursed memory, an echo reverberating in my mind where guilt twisted with vindication. I became the antagonist in my family's story, labeled as the villain who dared to expose the truth in the face of a flawless facade, while Morgan slipped deeper into denial, swaddled by the lies she had built her life upon until her phone began buzzing like a hornet's nest. Yet the only messages I received were warnings from friends out of fear of family repercussions for having spoken my mind. A week later, I awoke to a world shimmering with silence. The calls from my family had ceased, the chatter turned hollow, and every gathering near my doorstep became a reminder of the rift I had created, until Morgan's mother called me with that threatening tone, implying that I had pulled the curtain on a family scandal too sinister to ignore and told me that if I valued our relationship at all, I would confess and apologize, but I staunchly held my ground, knowing deep down our world was riddled with secrets worth preserving. But as tension morphed into shadows, something shifted in the air. Whispers followed me through the streets as contact became a dangerous commodity among family, where every encounter felt like a trial for my transgressions, and one particularly lonely night, as I sat on my porch nursing regrets, Morgan appeared without warning, her eyes clouded with uncertainty but her resolve sparked like wildfire. The once inseparable bond now lay ruptured, festering wounds of jealousy and betrayal threatening to drown any flicker of hope. She confessed that she had lived in fear, unable to tell anyone the truth about how she felt trapped in the mirage of success she had crafted, the facade becoming a noose as constricting as the expectations her mother thrust upon her. I watched her as she broke down, everything she personified crumbling into a cascade of tears. I thought this vulnerability might grant us the catharsis needed, but instead, the revelation left a bitter taste that thickened the already toxic atmosphere. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere thickened with dread, but I could not shake the feeling that I had unleashed something dark and vast into our lives. But it wasn't until Morgan threatened to seek her truth among strangers and let the world see what lay beneath our collective skin, that I understood how fragile our positions were. Each word we exchanged now felt like blades sharp enough to cleave the very fabric of our belonging, and I wondered if I had become the architect of my own isolation, torn between the vindication of honesty and the warmth of denial that had wrapped us like a cocoon for too long. When the day finally dawned, bright yet oppressive, I found myself spiraling, the daylight harsh against my regret as Morgan prepared to reveal all on social media. My heart pounded like a war drum, my vision tunneled in on the inevitable pain, but when she finally pressed send, I was left gasping in shock as the floodgates opened. Those who had smiled at her celebration turned into virtual haters, cloaked in anonymity yet wielding their venom like knives as they punctured her facade, leaving Morgan in the ruins of her own making, shattered pieces drifting away as their words became anchors that dragged her deeper into despair. In the aftermath, as relatives distanced themselves and the truth morphed into its own gelatinous monster, I wondered whether I had been right all along or merely too cowardly to save us from the inevitable. And as Morgan sat in a self-constructed prison of hate and sorrow, I learned through the lens of my own brokenness that sometimes, saying the hard truth reveals scars too deep to heal, leaving behind a silence that echoes louder than any shout of victory could ever hope to drown. It was a rainy Saturday morning, and the small coffee shop on the corner was packed, mirroring the storm outside with its chaotic energy. I managed to snag the last table, a tiny two-seater with a view of the dripping city streets, just as the door swung open to let in a gust of wind and a figure I would soon come to regret. She stumbled in, a wild-haired woman in a tattered raincoat, her face obscured by a tangle of frizzy curls, and for an instant, everything around me fell silent. She hovered in the doorway like some tragic specter. I caught a whiff of her as she approached the counter to order, and it hit me like a brick wall: sweat, rot and something I couldn't quite place, a medley of unkempt days stacked one atop the other like trash piling up in a back alley. I instinctively retracted my shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the people left standing in the queue, but they all wore expressions of discomfort, mirroring my own. Every instinct told me to maintain my distance. Her essence intruded upon the coffee shop's warm, cinnamon-tinged ambience. I was already watching people navigate between the tables, searching for a place to sit, and as I sipped cautiously on my overly sweet vanilla latte, I hoped she would find a corner where her smell wouldn't reach me. But life is never that simple. She approached my table, draped her coat over the back of the chair opposite me, and smiled a toothy grin that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Is this seat taken?" she chirped, and the pit in my stomach deepened as the aroma clung to the air around us, a thick, suffocating blanket that made my brain scream for escape. I wanted to be polite, to tell her I was waiting for someone, but the words caught in my throat, twisted by the harsh reality of her scent clinging to every surface. Instead, I cleared my throat, forcing a strained smile. "Actually, I'm just waiting for a friend," I replied, emphasizing the word friend like it was a sacred charm. She blinked and leaned in closer, the stench intensifying as if she had inhaled all the miseries of the world and exhaled them right in my direction. "Oh, come on, there's no need for that," she said, her voice a strange mix of persistence and desperation that instantly spat in the face of my discomfort. "It's a crowded place, just a quick sit until they find a seat." I felt my throat tighten further. I wanted to rise like a ghost, but the warmth of the latte paled in comparison to the cold, invading anxiety clawing at my chest. I could feel the eyes around us narrow in scrutiny, silently judging me, and I knew that I had to stand my ground because the alternative was unthinkable. I shook my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry, but I really can't. I need some space." The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the whole cafe held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Her expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a flicker of indignation igniting beneath the surface of her frazzled exterior. "You're really going to turn me away? Just because of how I smell?" she hissed, her voice dropping low yet piercing, echoing between tables, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and muted chatter that seemed to suddenly fade into mere background noise. My chest tightened, caught between a wave of guilt and the suffocating dread of being captured by her discomfort. I wanted to scream to the world that I wasn't the bad guy here, that this wasn't about her as a person, that my senses were fighting a losing battle against her reality. But it was too late. In her narrowed eyes, I saw the slow dawning realization that I might be one of the few people refusing to let her presence invade their space. She sat back, huffing, shoulders slumping, tail between her legs. I could tell she felt it, the weight of her own isolation, the lack of kindness in an unfriendly world, but I was drowning, gasping for clean air. That's when she leaned forward again, eyes alight with something indefinable, an unsettling spark swirling behind them. You know, there's a name for people like you. They call you made of money and you turn your back on someone who just needs to rest. You won't remember this moment, you'll move on with your perfect, clean life while I'm left here in the dirt you won't even acknowledge. I braced myself for a possible outburst, but every moment of tension bent its spine back upon itself, wrapping the room in an atmosphere thick with anticipation. I wanted to hurl my guilt at her, to explain that I didn't have a perfect life, I had bills that made me sweat in my sleep and deadlines that haunted me. But her words cut deeper, and I found myself staring down into my latte, the froth swirling like crowded thoughts in my mind as shame crept over me like a thief in the night. I'm not the bad guy here, I attempted to insist, voice trembling with uncertainty and helplessness, but I was drowning in her eyes, the raw emotion behind them flaying the fabric of my justification. Then, slowly, she straightened, mouth a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of someone who found joy, it was the brittle kind that echoed of deep wounds and ancient hurts that made me wonder how often had she been ridiculed in this very way. Anger flared briefly at the edge of my thoughts, casting shadows of self-doubt into the void. Was I really the monster I'd been painted to be? The onlookers shifted in discomfort. It appeared to be a performance now, a spectator's sport of empathy versus survival. The barista even paused as she made cappuccinos, casting sideways glances at us as the mayhem unfolded. I wish I could have shrunk down into the woven fabric of the chair, to escape the twisted narrative taking form. You know what, she said finally, a dangerous confidence threading her voice, you might think you're better than me now, but if you saw what I saw, if you felt what I feel, you'd run screaming into the night. My stomach churned as her words slithered into my mind, sharp and sinuous, and I did not want to imagine. We were worlds apart, yet standing in the same coffee shop, and I wasn't proud of the thoughts rolling through my head, thoughts that toyed with my sanity, testing the limits of my own humanity. I could hear my heart pounding within the petrified silence, the air thick as if the rain outside had seeped into our souls. Every interaction matters, she hissed, leaning closer still, unyielding. I held my breath, feeling myself unravel, wishing for the comfort of ignorance, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she added, you think you understand what hell smells like, don't you? The way she said it settled into my mind, twisting something deep inside me that tasted like regret and fear. I suddenly feared she could see through my facade, peel back my parameters and expose all that lay in ruin beneath. I was just about to protest, to shove her back into the abyss she claimed to know so intimately when, without a moment's warning, her left hand moved with precision to her coat pocket. Instinctually, I shrank back, my heart racing, wondering what she could possibly produce from that tangle of fabric. But then a glint caught the light, and in the size of an instant, I realized it was a small brass key, the kind you might find in an old hotel room. You know, ever since I showed up, you have been hating this moment, she whispered fiercely. But I could set you free, you know? I keep the worst of them at bay, all you have to do is ask. My gaze darted around the coffee shop, searching desperately for a sign of absurdity, for anyone to back me, but their eyes had diverted, and I was left tethered to this strange, grim pact looming at the fringes of sanity. What are you talking about? I challenged, although I sounded more confused than defiant. She leaned closer still, and I felt the unmistakable sting of desperation and danger weaving through the air. I know people think I smell bad, but you don't understand. There are demons where you can't see, they cling to people who let them in. I've held them back. You don't have to live with that fear. I shook my head, shifting back in my chair, but she moved closer until her breath grazed my face. Let me show you. I couldn't shake the sensation sprinting up my spine, her hand twitched like it was beckoning me to reach out. Then it was as if the world around us fell away, like I was in a dark vessel with no exit, feeling hovering eyes that weighed heavy upon my back. The scent, the woman, everything converged into a living nightmare before it struck me how wretchedly hopeless I felt. Was it wrong to reject her? Was I complicit in her suffering? The air was thick with a bittersweet kind of tension, like looking in the mirror and not recognizing who stared back. And in that fleeting moment, I could hear whispers creeping down the edges of reality, muddying the waters of my sanity. You could run, she was saying, but wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know what you push away, what you so readily abandon in your comfortable life? Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to refuse, to go back to my latte and the momentary safety of shallow pleasantries, but I felt something else kindle inside me. I leaned slightly closer, just a breath as I murmured, "What do I need to do?" The laughter returned, twisted and sharp, but then her expression shifted, and she froze, eyes glimmering with sanity and chaos interspersed. "Nothing, really. Just acknowledge what is around you. Just for one moment." And then in that celebrated whiplash, I gasped as she broke into a wide grin and suddenly the cafe fell silent. I twisted my head around like a puppet on strings to see what lay behind me, but there wasn't anything there, just the reflective glass that taunted my confusion. "Your demons are real, but they take many shapes," she continued, voice low and mesmerizing, and in that inward feeling, the vibrations of anxiety raced up my throat. The key suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hand, like it was holding a world I couldn't comprehend. "Acknowledge them, and you might find what really haunts you isn't me at all." And just like that, a shiver coursed up my spine, underlining the unsettling reality that perhaps I shouldn't have pushed her away. Perhaps I would walk out of this coffee shop and carry her stench with me, her essence following, wrapped around my neck like a noose tightening with every breath. What turned from laughter shifted back to suspicion again, and the weight of the moment crashed down, but it was too late. I was scared, held captive by the disconcerting truth behind my own choices, and as the crowd connected with fleeting uncertainty, this woman, in her tattered raincoat, had opened the door to something buried deep within. Darkness doesn't require permission, it just waits in the shadows, waiting to devour you whole while you dismiss those looking for refuge, blurring the lines between safety and fear. I straightened, the coffee shop's familiarity almost gone, as her stormy eyes implored me to see beyond my aversion. And deep down, as the rain thrummed against the windows and people shifted in their chairs, I realized I might have made a choice in that moment, a choice that I would come to reckon with long after we parted ways. The coffee shop could never provide the safety I craved, only a fleeting mask over hidden truths. My heart raced in anticipation of what lay beyond, and I suddenly needed more than just my latte. I needed to discover the depths of those demons lurking just out of sight, ready to carve a path I wouldn't soon forget. I never thought a high school election could be the catalyst for so much chaos, but when I found myself losing the race for class president to Alex, a guy who was as popular as a sparkling social media influencer and twice as fake, something inside me snapped. Leading up to the election, I had poured my heart into my campaign, pouring countless hours into speeches and posters, all while trying to promote my vision of a more inclusive school, only to watch as Alex waltzed around, throwing lavish parties and posting perfectly staged selfies that made me feel like a ghost compared to his booming presence. On that fateful day, as the countdown to the announcement ticked down, I felt an undercurrent of dread snaking through my thoughts, an awareness that my passion for change stood no chance against shallow charm. When the principal finally declared Alex the winner, the sound of raucous applause and laughter felt like a dagger plunging into my chest, leaving me breathless with anger and humiliation. In a fit of rage, I stormed out of the auditorium, unable to contain my gnawing frustration, not just at losing but at the entire system that glorified mediocrity over genuine effort. I was tired of pretending it didn't matter. It did matter. Fueled by indignation, I hastily drafted a resignation letter on my phone, angrily posting it in our class group chat, bitterly declaring that there was no way someone like Alex could lead us. I thought my message might resonate, maybe even go viral around the school, but instead, it was met with a silence that felt heavier than the thundering applause I had just witnessed. The next day, however, my decision spiraled into something far more sinister. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but not of support. Instead, my peers turned on me, the whispers and snickers echoing down hallways like a haunting wind, leaving me isolated. I had unleashed something I couldn't contain, a dark curiosity started spreading. Who were these people I once called friends, who pretended loyalty while eagerly stoking the coals of someone else's success? I began to notice strange things around me, my locker mysteriously jammed with an array of sticky notes, taunting me with phrases like "just a loser" or "a standing ovation for Alex." Every morning before first period, there was something new, something that felt eerily tailored just for me, an intelligent push of humiliation that seemed to stalk my every step. That's when I saw the first video, a poorly lit, grainy clip of a group of students huddled together near the library, whispering and pointing at me, hatching conspiracies about my sour grapes and my unpopularity. It made my skin crawl. The realization that I was being hunted, and not for sport, but for fun, twisted their laughter into something monstrous. I tried talking to a teacher, but the weight of my accusations fell flat. They simply encouraged me to turn the other cheek and think positively. But how could I? Those whispers chose me as their entertainment. I knew I couldn't let this go. I began obsessively scrolling through social media, seeking recognition of my turmoil, wondering if others felt it too. I stumbled upon an obscure forum, a shadowy place where school dramas festered and spilled into the digital abyss, a chaotic collection of stories that made mine seem mundane. But buried in that cacophony was a community that thrived on misfortune, a hive intent on exposing what they deemed hidden truths. It was the perfect storm, and I couldn't look away. As weeks turned into months, I became a reluctant participant in this new narrative unfolding, a corner of cyberspace that amplified the vindictive laughter I felt daily. I learned that Alex wasn't just skating by on privilege, he had secrets of his own, and in that forum, I was pushed by an anonymous figure toward the darkest corners of gossip. I started posting about my experiences, disguised through an anonymous handle, weaving a narrative that cast me as the unyielding hero fighting against the corruption. I expected support, but received something unexpected, a raw, visceral acknowledgement of pain. Those who saw my plight echoed it back to me, but the moment I dared to mention Alex's shadowy connections, the laughter morphed into something darker, urging me to dig deeper. Days turned into a fever dream, losing track of what was real and what was a manufactured facade. So, when I finally decided to take action, concocting elaborate schemes to expose Alex, plotting to record him making lewd remarks hidden behind the bathrooms, my sense of moral clarity was long gone. I knew I had crossed a line, but it was intoxicating, like a drug feeding a mania that pulsated through every fiber of my being. Now, even in the dead of night, I would scroll through my phone, glued to what was once my biggest fear, the threat of being unknown, the scorn of being invisible, all black and white images blurring into the chaotic storm that consumed me. Then came the night that everything crashed. In the depths of a swirling digital web, Alex's world collided with mine, and secrets fell like raindrops during a storm. During a party, I confronted him, armed with evidence of his misdeeds but ended up cornered, outnumbered by his smug entourage. I was desperate, crying out about everything that had been done to me, about the lies and the clenched fists of the school's social hierarchy, but no one cared. They laughed at my anguish, drowning me in a cascade of ridiculing comments and shoves. The weight of humiliation twisted inside me, morphing into something more sinister, until I felt myself reach a breaking point. I don't know what happened next, maybe adrenaline took over or something darker that had been festering inside erupted like a volcano, but in that moment, I snapped. I lunged at Alex, screaming. The throng around us scattered, shocked, but it didn't matter. I felt unstoppable as I threw him against a wall, the sound of his head connecting with the metal locker echoing through the hallway, a warning clap to the mocking audience. As the chaos unfolded around me, blurred by my own rage, I thought about how everything had gotten so out of hand, how a simple school election had turned me from hopeful visionary to deranged antagonist in my own story. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't hide any more from the truth that had chased me simply because I had chosen to be vulnerable. There, in that moment of exposed honesty, I didn't care if it cost me everything. I was done being the side character in someone else's narrative. Ida for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent. It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop: an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know." I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity. My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features, as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. Ida for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. I never thought a simple visit to the grocery store would spiral into my own personal horror story, but that's exactly what happened last Wednesday evening when I encountered a mother and her 8-year-old son, a boy who, at first glance, seemed like your typical kid but quickly revealed an unsettling darkness. I was just trying to pick up a few essentials, milk, bread, you know the drill, when I noticed the boy running wild through the aisles, screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing items on the floor like it was his own personal playground. His mother was oblivious, seemingly texting distractedly on her phone while he sprinted down the cereal aisle, knocking boxes left and right. At first, I thought it was amusing, maybe even a harmless little tantrum, but as I watched him shove a box of Frosted Flakes into another shopper's cart, laughter turned to unease. The slap of cardboard hitting tile echoed in the empty aisle, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as he turned to me with eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin stretching across his face that seemed far too old for a child. I glanced at his mother, expecting her to at least scold him, but she just kept scrolling, her expression blank, as if her son's chaos barely registered. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. I approached her, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I said, my heart racing even as I attempted to remain calm, "I think you might want to keep a closer eye on your son. He's causing quite the mess." To my dismay, she looked up, annoyance flashing in her eyes as if I were the problem. "It's just a little fun," she snapped, rolling her eyes and returning to her phone, dismissing me in a way that sent chills down my spine. That grin from her son widened, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. Left with no choice, I decided to confront the child directly. After all, children respond to authority, right? "Hey buddy," I said, squatting down to his level, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "how about we help your mom and clean this up together?" His laughter echoed eerily in the silence, and then he took a single step back, looking me up and down with a knowing glint in his eye that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You can't make me," he said, voice low and steady, way too serious for someone his age. I felt a chill race through me, a primal instinct to back off, but I pushed forward. "You'll get in trouble if you don't behave." For a moment, it seemed like my words had cut through the fog, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. But then he just laughed again, this deep, guttural sound that echoed through the aisle, and I recoiled, suddenly feeling foolish for even trying. Almost as if the darkness inside him had risen to the surface, he spread his arms, as if preparing for flight, letting out a shriek so piercing it felt like it shattered glass. The commotion caught the attention of a nearby employee, who jogged over, eyebrows raised at the chaos unfolding before him, but as he stepped up to intervene, the boy turned and sprinted in the other direction, darting down the aisle and knocking over a display of snack cakes. In his wake, bewildered shoppers merely stared, shifting their bags and exchanging unsure glances. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I had no idea that feeling would soon become a reality. As the mother finally began to gather her son, I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe she would see reason after all. But as she stepped closer, her face contorted in anger, she aimed her ire at me. "What the hell is your problem? He's just a kid." A deathly silence enveloped the aisle, and I could hear a pin drop as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the mother. I could feel my cheeks flush with heat. After all, I was just trying to help. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just a typical grocery store visit anymore, it had turned into something much darker. "He's out of control," I stammered, my voice wavering slightly under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe if you paid attention." But before I could finish my sentence, the boy reappeared behind her, that same twisted grin plastered across his face, but this time, it felt like a veil of malice had descended over the air. Don't you think she began, but the boy suddenly lunged at me, tackling my legs and causing me to stumble back, the world tilting as I hit the hard floor. My hands instinctively shot out to catch myself, pain sparking up my palms. Glaring up at the ceiling, I caught a glimpse of the kid running toward the entrance, laughter dancing on his lips, echoing in the empty space like a haunting memory. "Get him," I shouted, my voice hoarse as I regained my footing, but my cries were lost in a cacophony of chaos, the mother just standing there in shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was surreal, feeling powerless as the crowd around us erupted into confusion, and I felt a sick realization washing over me. I had crossed a line, had intervened where I should have simply walked away. With each passing moment, tension thickened the air, and soon, I felt the terror of this bizarre scenario settle deeply in my gut. Crazily enough, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. I dashed after the boy just as he slipped out the glass doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of clarity, and my heart pounding in my chest as I shouted again, "Stop!" He raced toward the parking lot, the glow of headlights flickering erratically, but just as I was about to reach him, a strange sensation washed over me, some primal instinct screaming to run away. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, darker than the night itself, seeming to draw in all the light around him, and I felt my body freeze, paralyzed in fear as if some unseen force was holding me in place. "You can't stop me," he said, the childish lilt of his voice twisted into something unrecognizable, and in that moment, I could swear I saw a flicker of malice, no, a flicker of something far worse, deep within him that confirmed my worst fears. This child was not just out of control, there was something inherently wrong with him. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf me, but I was rooted, lost in those eyes that shone with an ancient malevolence, an echo of something that should never belong in a child. I felt the wind whispering warnings to me, but the moment I finally turned to run, I felt a sharp pain straining through my back. Looking down in disbelief, I realized that the boy, I don't even know how, was suddenly upon me, and he had stuck a butcher knife into my side, the world swiftly fading into a crimson haze as pain engulfed my senses. Everything became muffled and distant, the screams, the sirens, the horrified gasps of passers-by became a bizarre symphony, swelling as I crumpled to the ground, the cool concrete cradling me as I gasped for breath, caught in an inescapable nightmare. As I lay there, eyes flickering shut against an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole, I could hear the mother call out to him, "David, come back." But her voice sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world. In my fading moments, my mind was a whirlpool of regrets, of could-haves and should-haves, realizing too late that when the line between innocence and darkness blurs, it is often the innocent who pay the ultimate price. All I started with was a simple commentary on parenting, and now I was just another casualty in a tale nobody would believe. I've always been protective of my belongings, especially my expensive headphones. They were a gift from my grandfather before he passed, and they're not just headphones, they're a piece of my history, my sanctuary. Living in a small, cramped apartment with my roommate, Jenna, had its challenges, especially when it came to boundaries. Jenna was charming in her own right, a free spirit, a whirlwind of messy hair and bright laughter that could fill a room, but she also had a way of pushing my limits, always borrowing things without asking and then somehow convincing me it was totally okay. A few months ago, she borrowed my headphones for the first time, saying her own had broken, and though I had reservations, I couldn't say no when she gave me that pleading look. But when I noticed the small scratches on the ear pads upon their return, my stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. It felt like she was borrowing not just my headphones but part of my soul, and every damage was a betrayal. Weeks passed, and I resolved to keep the headphones locked up whenever I left the apartment, but last Friday, she approached me with her typical sunny smile, asking to borrow them just for a quick session. I hesitated, feeling that familiar unease wash over me. "Please, just for a couple of hours. I promise I'll be super careful." But recalling the state they had returned in last time, I couldn't help but instinctively shake my head. The conversation escalated. She accused me of being selfish and paranoid, and while she ranted, I felt my heart race, my mind racing as I tried to explain the value of that gift, but my words fell upon deaf ears. It spiraled into a shouting match, and I was ready to slam the door against her face just to feel vindicated for standing my ground. But when night fell and I thought I would have the space to breathe, something felt off. As I lay in bed, the silence of the apartment grew oppressive, and a creeping sense of dread settled over me. The moment I heard the unmistakable click of the door opening, my heart stopped. I glanced at my phone, 2:13 a.m. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but the soft sound of something sliding against the hardwood floor got louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of my headphones being moved. I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Peeking around the corner into the dimly lit living room, I saw Jenna hunched over my desk, glancing back nervously, her fingers intertwined with the cords of my headphones, the terrible glint of defiance in her eyes. "I know you're up." "It's just a pair of headphones," she hissed, her tone laced with an eerie calmness that sent chills down my spine. I could have chosen to scream, to lash out or call her out, but something deep within me made me instinctively choose a cold silence, watching eerily as she continued to act like a thief in the night. An unsettling rush washed over me. I knew then that this wasn't about the headphones, this was a battle of wills, and I had no intention of losing. "You think I'm just going to let you take them?" I finally managed to whisper, breaking our shared silence, my voice low enough to shake among the shadows. The moment stretched into an eternity as her eyes widened in surprise, but then, to my horror, a sinister smile crept across her face, as though she relished being challenged. "You need to lighten up, you really do," she said, her voice becoming mocking, each word dripping with disdain. "The world won't end if you just let go a little." I felt a fire spark in my chest, booting my fight or flight instincts into high gear, as I stepped out into the living room, the shadows closing in around me like a predator ready to pounce. "You're not taking them from me, Jenna," I said, now resolute. Her confusion morphed into anger, and in return, I felt an unnatural strength overcome me. It was almost like I was possessed by a vengeful spirit teaching me the gravity of self-defense. Just as she reached for the headphones, I lunged, gripping her wrist tightly as I felt the aura shift between us, transforming the air into ice. After a tense grapple, she finally shoved me away, stumbling back, and in that moment, something terrifying happened. The lights flickered, casting a creepy shadow against the walls, dancing as if mirroring our turmoil. "You don't understand what you're asking for," she whispered, her voice suddenly trembling. "You don't know what happens when you refuse someone something they want." The atmosphere became thick with unsung words. My pulse quickened, every rational thought screaming for me to vacate the situation, but I was locked in, eyes wide as Jenna approached me, menacingly, almost hypnotically. "You think this was just about the headphones? You're clueless, and now," she leaned closer until I could smell her panic and desperation, "now you're in the way." Before I could react, the faint blare of my headphones crackled to life, pulling me out of her chaotic hold. Colors swirled as if the universe had reset. I closed my eyes, feeling the world spin, a haunting whisper flooding my senses, "You should have let me borrow them." As the sound overtook me, I realized too late that I had not only lost my headphones but perhaps something far more precious, my peace of mind. I bolted from the apartment, not daring to look back, propelling me through the night air and into the unknown, knowing I could never step foot back in there again. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most harbor darkness just waiting for the slightest chance to uncover itself, and sometimes, in refusing something that feels insignificant, you find that you've awakened something truly terrifying lurking just beneath the surface. I never thought I would reach a point where I had to make a post like this, but here I am, desperate for validation on whether I'm the asshole in this twisted situation. It all started last spring when my brother, Mark, began showing up unannounced at my apartment. At first, I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd drop in with some lame excuse about needing to borrow a tool or ask for advice on his car, but as weeks passed, his visits morphed from casual to obsessive. It wasn't long before I noticed things started to feel off. He'd expertly manipulate the conversation to shift focus to my life, probing about my job, my friendships, my love life, as if gathering data to fuel some hidden agenda. I brushed it off as sibling curiosity at first, shrugging it away until that one fateful afternoon I came home from work to find my door wide open. Panic washed over me as I rushed inside, heart racing, to find my apartment completely intact. But there, in the living room, was a note rested on my coffee table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You need to be more open to me." It unnerved me more than I could express. Was I being paranoid? I decided to confront him, and when I did, Mark laughed it off, insisting I was reading too much into it. But I was no longer comfortable with him just popping by whenever he felt like it. I needed my space. So, after much deliberation, I made the decision to change the locks. When I told him, he looked at me, the laughter draining from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. He said nothing but walked away, a shadow crossing his features. A week later, I woke up in the dead of night to the distinct sound of my door jiggling. My heart pounded as I froze in fear, listening carefully, praying it was just an old pipe or a figment of my imagination. But no, the rattling persisted for what felt like hours, and then it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for the right moment to breach my sanctuary. I buried myself in my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. Mark was relentless. The next morning, I found more notes scattered around my apartment, all manner of things from "I just want to help" to "why can't you see I'm your only family." It was suffocating, the pervasive sense of dread that began to chase me through my days. I felt trapped in a nightmare, and the lines of love and manipulation blurred until there was nothing left but darkness. I decided to take action. I went to the police station and filed a report. They couldn't do much, just a recognized nuisance, they said. As I left, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to protect me. Every break in my routine, every sound outside my window incited pure terror. I looked for any chance to escape, weekend getaways, late-night shifts, anything to avoid the haunting presence of my brother. And then one stormy evening, with thunder rumbling and rain pouring like the sky itself was breaking apart, someone banged on my window. It was Mark, drenched and grinning in a way that set off alarm bells in my mind. Surprise. I thought I'd come over to help you with that article you're working on. The sickening jolt of dread coursed through my veins. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I quickly mumbled something and darted to the door, locking it just as he reached for the handle. But I could see him through the peephole, my own brother. His grin widened, but his eyes were wild, icicles of twisted madness in the torrential downpour. With every thump of his fist against the door, the world outside blurred, leaving only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I was losing my grip, feeling as if I was slipping into some alternate reality. Was I the villain for wanting space? Was it wrong to feel caged by someone who claimed to love me, or was I just pushing him away? I yelled at him to leave, realizing too late the trap I had walked into, his soft chuckle echoing unnervingly through the night. "But I'm your family. We're supposed to be close." I finally lost it, my voice cracking as I screamed, "Aren't you supposed to care about what I want?" And just like that, the laughter stopped. Mark's expression shifted, his mouth tightened as he said, "You think you can change the locks on family? You can't escape me." I bolted to my bedroom, fumbling for my phone, but as I turned, I saw him standing in my living room, having somehow slipped through a window I thought I had locked. My breath caught in my throat as he said very calmly, "It's not just the lock settling the score, sis. You need to learn that family always finds a way in." Then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, I was sprawled on the floor of my apartment with no memory of what happened next, but one thing was clear: in that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in a family tied tighter than the strongest chain, each link weighed down with the burden of madness. My brother was no longer just a sibling, he had become something beyond that, something dangerous, twisted. Now, as I sit here, typing this, I can't help but wonder if I did the right thing by confronting him, changing the locks, and asking him to stay away. But the truth is, I still hear his laughter echoing through the walls, and that little voice keeps haunting me. Ida for telling my brother to stop coming unannounced. I think I might be the biggest fool for thinking I could change the locks on the chains binding us. I remember the day my friend Jay gave me the expensive clothes like it was etched into my mind, a vibrant blur of silk and stitch set against the mundane backdrop of my cluttered apartment. Jay was a fashion influencer, strutting through life like a peacock, draped in designer pieces that sparkled in the sunlight. We met in college, two misfits who bonded over weird hobbies and alternative music, and just when I thought I was past the days of scraping by, Jay surprised me with bags overflowing with items from his latest collaboration, luxury clothes that danced around their own presence with excellence. My heart swelled at the gift. I didn't just see clothes, but a ticket to a world I felt I could never belong to, a place where confidence dripped from every seam. For weeks, I wore those clothes like armor, striding through life with newfound bravado. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers complimented me, their kind words wrapping around me like a warm embrace as I reveled in the prestige those clothes brought. But as my inner circle of friends began to dwindle, whispers ran through our group. Some suggested I sell them for a quick buck, pieces like that fetched sky-high prices, they said, while others told me horror stories about friends who had borrowed expensive items and ruined them. One night, over too many cheap beers and too much bravado, I decided to post the clothes online, just to see what interest might spark, but when I woke up that morning, I felt sick at the thought. Jay had spat out warnings about the pitfalls of selling gifts, their possessions no longer, and the moment you let them go, something within you starts to wither just like that little green plant in my apartment that never thrived. The next day, Jay texted me, asking if I'd reconsider. His tone was neither accusing nor pleading, simply curious, had I really done it? I agonized, my stomach twisting like a kite caught in the wind, and the guilt clawed at me like a feral cat. I texted back, I didn't sell it, I just thought about it. His response was cool, but something flickered in the back of my mind. Was he disappointed? That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine, a low, gravelly tone that pierced through the average daytime noise. "It's important you meet me," it rasped, and something deep in my gut screamed danger. I hung up, my heart racing like a train on a crooked track, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me for days. Then came the confrontation over dinner, the smells of pizza and soda fading into a background haze as Jay's voice cut through the silence. "You need to sell them, you're missing the opportunity here," he urged, but there was something darker behind his eyes, the flicker of something almost predatory, and as I lifted my glass, I realized that his grip on the table trembled slightly. "You don't get it. I can't take something precious and just throw it away," I reasoned, but he leaned closer, and I was struck by an icy claw of fear. "They don't belong to you," he hissed, his fingers curling like talons around the remnants of his slice of pizza, and I felt that inexplicable emptiness inside me flare into something jagged and immense. Later that night as I tossed and turned, my phone buzzed like a vibrant insect in the darkness. It was Jay, asking me for a photo of the clothes, seemingly innocent, but I could feel that disturbing edge underneath, coiling tighter around my mind. Caught between paranoia and friendship, I decided to ignore it, but my reluctance spiraled into an insatiable paranoia as every knock on my door echoed through my dreams. Weeks crawled by, and out of nowhere, I began receiving mysterious messages, strangers reaching out claiming to know Jay, their words slick with venom that suggested I needed to wear those clothes again or risk facing a spiritual wrath. The clothes, I learned, bore an offense only those deep in the fashion underworld could understand. They weren't mere garments, they were trophies of popularity, each thread woven from the hopes and struggles of those who desired fame before me. What had I stumbled into? I wondered, but every time I tried to confront Jay, he sidestepped me, elusive and disquietingly charming. One evening, in an effort to reclaim control, I turned on the lights in my living room and held the clothes hostage in plain sight, confronting them like they were sentient beings with an unholy agenda. I snapped a picture, half expecting to see demons lurking around the edges of the frame. Days passed in a muffled haze, but then came the night. It was stormy, the wind howling like a pack of lost souls. I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, considering burning them rather than selling them, my heart drumming with the rhythm of fear and guilt. That's when the phone rang, eyes wide. I answered, and it was Jay again, frantic and clawing. "You want your life back. You have to wear them. If you don't, you'll never be free," he screamed through the receiver, almost incoherent. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I hung up, a tempest of panic swelled, but an insidious part of me wondered if wearing the clothes would liberate me from the shackles that had been tightening around my heart. Just that night, amid crashing thunder, I slipped into the most regal piece Jay had gifted me. Instantly, a wave of euphoria washed over, making me feel alive and powerful. The clothes wrapped around me like an embrace that transcended simple aesthetics. But as dawn approached and the light turned madly crimson, a creeping sensation clawed its way up my spine, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the old mirror. The reflection that looked back at me was distorted, twisted. It was Jay's face morphing into mine, wearing my own features in a grotesque parody. I felt the full weight of the clothes dragging me deeper into a void, and suddenly the price of acceptance became evident. The expensive threads were binding me to him. I stumbled back, ripping the clothes off as the fabric felt like razor blades against my skin, and while they landed in a heap on the floor, the moment they fell, the twisted vision vanished. Jay called for me again, begging, pleading, almost crying, and I went cold inside. I locked my door and tossed the clothes into the old furnace in my building's basement, adrenaline buzzing like a hive. Before I could feel relief, the pounding on my apartment door echoed through my mind. Jay, desperately wanting to reclaim what was his, but they weren't his anymore. "You can't throw them away. "They're mine to control," he shouted, his voice breaking and unraveling into something almost pitiful. I didn't respond, just sat against the door, feeling the weight of both decisions crashing onto my shoulders. Hours crept by, and as the sun rose, I felt the tension lift as if a dark cloud had finally broken. But as I settled into that dawning tranquility, my phone buzzed with notifications, cold dread seeping back into my bones. Picture after picture poured in, Jay wearing them one by one, each snap more distorted and vengeful than the last. The final image etched a nightmare into my mind, Jay's face, grinning sickeningly as he held up a crude feedback board of my friends begging me to join them in this fashion parade, my reflection emerging from the depths of hell itself, a twisted war of dominance vibrant enough to burn the retina. At that moment, lying on my kitchen floor, I felt like I was ripped apart by threads of consequence and heartbreak. Jay wasn't just a friend anymore, he was a creature of desire, hungry for the essence that tethered me to the world I thought I understood. I was escalating into his warped image of fame, and all I could do was huddle in the corner of the room, wondering whether the price was too steep. It dawned on me then that the clothes hadn't just been a gift, they were a curse, a striking reminder that sometimes, when greed wraps its hands around your heart, it obliterates not just what you have but the familiar warmth of the person you thought you once knew. It was meant to be a simple first hangout, just me and Jenna, who I'd been crushing on since the moment I saw her in that crowded cafe, her laughter spilling like sunlight over the murky coffee, so when she invited me to a hike in the woods, I didn't think twice. I picked her up, my heart racing as I wondered if she'd notice my overenthusiastic cologne masking the scent of my nerves. The trail was gorgeous, dappled with autumn leaves, the air crisp and cool, and her presence felt electric, sending jolts of warmth through me even as the temperature dropped. As we trekked deeper into the woods, I found myself lost in conversation, trading stories about our childhoods and awkward high school moments, every laugh pulling us closer, every shared secret feeling like a pact. But as we reached a clearing glinting with sunlight, Jenna shivered slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She glanced at my oversized sweater, and with a playful grin, she asked if she could borrow it, clearly not ready for the chill settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. My instinct was to shrug it off and give it to her, but something about her request sent an icy tingle down my spine. Maybe it was that acute awareness of how easily one moment could shift into an entirely different reality. I hesitated, looking into her eyes, which flickered with both surprise and disappointment at my pause, and I finally said, "I think I'd rather not." It's, my favorite, which was a total lie, but I didn't know why I felt the need to withhold it. The flinch that crossed her face was subtle yet profound, but she quickly brushed it off, and we resumed our hike, the laughter now tinged with a hint of unease that I couldn't shake. The sun was almost gone, splattering the sky in streaks of orange and purple that felt surreal against the looming shadows that began to swallow the path we hadn't even realized we had ventured off. As we walked, the air turned heavy, and I noticed the woods felt different, as if everything was holding its breath, and I half wondered if the forest itself had come alive, watching our every step. We stumbled upon an old cabin, partially obscured by gnarled trees, its windows like empty eyes staring into the wilderness, and Jenna seemed drawn to it, almost against her will. I felt the instinct to grab her arm when she stepped towards the door, but it felt absurd. I wasn't her protector, just the guy who refused to give her my sweater. As if sensing my hesitation, Jenna turned to me, her expression eerily blank for someone who had just been speaking so animatedly. "Let's go check it out," she said with a tone that felt oddly detached, and despite every warning bell clanging in my mind, I followed her inside, the door creaking as if lamenting the intrusion. Inside, the air hung thick and musty, with wooden beams that groaned under the weight of years forgotten. Shadows cast by our flashlights flickered across the walls, revealing remnants of a life abandoned, a broken chair, dust-coated dishes piled in the corner. But one thing struck me as we explored, it felt wrong, almost like we had stepped into a scene that was not ours to witness. Jenna laughed suddenly, her voice echoing oddly in the silence, but when I turned to her, I saw that the darkness had drawn something out of her, her eyes dancing with a strange light that pulled at my gut. "I feel so liberated, don't you?" "Like we're breaking the rules," she said, her smile wide but unsettling, as if she was channeling some hidden energy swirling in the air. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away slowly, sensing something sinister lurking behind that innocent facade, but she caught me by the wrist, her grip firm yet fragile, a mix of desperation and allure. I wanted to pull away, to leave, but the intensity of her gaze held me in place, paralyzing with both fear and fascination. Stay with me, just a bit longer, she whispered, and that was when I noticed shadows, long, curling shapes that seemed altogether too alive, creeping toward us from the corners of the cabin. Panic surged through me, the overpowering urge to flee clashing violently with my desire to keep Jenna close, but as I pried her fingers away and turned to run, a whisper echoed through the timbers, silky and suggestive yet dripping with malice, "You shouldn't have denied her the comfort of your warmth." I scrambled toward the door, my heart racing, but the shadows twisted and writhed, blocking my escape as Jenna's voice shifted, tinged now with desolation. "You'll regret this," she murmured, and beneath that familiar exterior, I caught a flicker of something else, something ancient and wrong that sent a chill ripping through my spine. As I finally shoved past the barrier of darkness and burst into the night, the weight of my decision crushed me. Was it worth it, not letting her borrow my sweater? The forest around me pulsed with an urgent energy as the last vestiges of light faded into the obsidian sky, and I sprinted back toward my car, glancing over my shoulder just once to see Jenna standing in the doorway of the cabin, her figure swallowed by shadows, but for a brief moment, she appeared almost ethereal, a desire woven into every sinew of her being. My heart clenched as I fumbled with my keys, entering the vehicle and slamming the door behind me, the haunting whispers still carving their way into my skull. I drove home in a daze, that night swirling in my mind as I grappled with what transpired, chills cascading down my body despite the warmth of my heater, wondering if I had just barely escaped something that could have consumed me whole. Now, days later, I replay the moment, obsession gnawing at my sanity, never quite shaken from the haunting image of Jenna, curiously beautiful yet impossibly insidious, but every time I try to shake off the fear, I hear her voice in my dreams, softly echoing, "You should have just let me wear your sweater." When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo?" she said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you?" "This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal, Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. I never thought a simple conversation would spiral into a nightmare that would haunt me for years, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I was sitting in my homeroom, surrounded by the hum of morning chatter, when Jacob, the class clown with a well-deserved reputation for chaos, turned to me with a smirk that made my stomach drop. Just moments before, I'd finally managed to brush off the whispers about my appearance. My thick glasses and untamed hair were like red flags to my peers, an invitation for their cruelty. But when Jacob said it, I felt the world around me fall away. He called me a slur I thought I'd never hear directed at me, a word loaded with hate and ignorance, so vile it caught in my throat like the last bite of a bad meal. I was frozen, my heart racing, knowing that confronting him would only lead to more taunts, but doing nothing felt like accepting defeat. After class, I couldn't shake off that moment, that bite of venom that whispered to me that I was less deserving of respect simply for being different. Against my better judgment, I decided to go to my guidance counselor, Mrs. Perkins, a woman known for her warm smile and the jam-packed schedule of students desperate to be heard. She was trusted by many, or so I thought. I walked in, rehearsing my words, ensuring that I could convey the hurt without sounding too weak. But as I recounted the story, I noticed her expression shift. It seemed like understanding morphed into disappointment. "You need to speak to him directly," she said, her voice steady yet devoid of compassion, and for a moment, I thought I was being brave, but a sense of dread settled in my chest. The next day, Jacob approached me with his usual swagger, but something was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, an expectation that coiled around us like a noose. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on us, holding their breath like they were waiting for a fight or, worse, a spectacle. Jacob leaned in closer, a sneer on his lips, and whispered, "You told on me, didn't you?" His voice dripped with malice, and in that moment, I realized I had walked into a trap of my own making. As I tried to find my voice, to say that I only wanted to be treated with a shred of dignity, he laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the empty hallways, and my stomach twisted in a painful knot. The humiliation built with every laugh that chimed in around me. It was a familiar family of taunts, all mercilessly joining in, and I felt my standing as the target solidifying so solidly that it shook my core. I wanted to deny everything, to crawl into myself and disappear, but Jacob leaned in even closer, taunting me to deny it. I stumbled over my words, unable to fight back, and he responded by tossing out another slur, like throwing a stone into a glass house. His words shattered any belief I had in justice, and the following weeks turned into a blur of relentless bullying, an onslaught that transformed my once quiet school life into a daily battle of survival. The more I tried to advocate for myself, the worse it got. Whispers crept into the cafeteria, photoshopped images emerged on social media, and suddenly I was the joke of our school year. Each day, I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, a flimsy shield against the arrows of cruelty that seemed to fly directly in my direction. I lost friends, I lost joy, and I sat in silence while my name became synonymous with ridicule. I began dreading the walk through those school doors, feeling the heavy weight of shame, like a cloak that had been stitched together by every cruel word. It was as if every laugh in the hallway was a reminder that some stories have no heroes, only victims. I started seeing Mrs. Perkins less as an ally and more as a source of disappointment. Her suggestion echoed in my mind: had I been weak by telling her? By doing something? I felt caught in a web of self-loathing and guilt, one that twisted itself tighter every time I was labeled as a tattle or, worse, a coward. My trust in adults wore thin, slipping through my fingers like sand as I realized this cacophony of cruelty felt tolerated. Days bled into weeks, each worse than the last, until one fateful afternoon when Jacob decided to take things further. During gym class, in a cruel stroke of fate, he managed to coordinate a moment that would forever mark my life. I was paired with him for a team exercise. The moment he stepped closer, I could smell the sweat mixed with arrogance, a vile combination that churned in my gut. "Are you going to run away like a little brat?" He sneered, pouring scorn into those words, and every ounce of my resolve melted away. Instead of freezing, instead of standing tall, anger surged through me, fueled by weeks of torment and shame. In a fit of rage, I swung my arm, a clumsy, desperate act born from pain, but it landed hard against his shoulder. The room silenced as if time itself had held its breath. I couldn't take my eyes off his shocked face, and for a fleeting moment, I felt powerful. But any sense of triumph was short-lived. Before I knew it, he retaliated with venomous fists, turning that forgotten gymnasium into a cage of chaos. I'd become the villain in my own story, surrounded by chaos, and the teachers pulled us apart, leaving us sitting in opposite corners of the principal's office as the narrative twisted. I was labeled the aggressor, the troublemaker, while Jacob donned his martyr's mask of innocence. Moments later, under the fluorescent lights that seemed to mock me, I finally spoke up, fearing for my future yet again. I recounted everything, how I had tried to stand up, how I had only wanted help, but in the eyes of the adults, I was merely misbehaving. "This isn't my fault," I cried, the desperation in my voice ringing hollow under their indifferent gazes. I became the conversation topic in whispers during lunch, and a target in the anxiety-ridden dreams that plagued me every night. My friends distanced themselves, afraid of catching what they labeled my drama. I lived in isolation, cocooned in a construct of my own guilt, paralyzed by the need for validation while crumbling beneath the weight of blame. The dreams turned darker, the whispers morphed into chants echoing in my head. I began to wonder if maybe I did belong in the shadows, if Jacob had been right all along. A year went by, each day a collection of silent scars grafted into my soul, and just when I began considering leaving school altogether, a weird email appeared in my inbox, one that made my breath hitch and my heart race. It contained a recorded conversation between Jacob and a mutual friend, a confession made in chuckles and arrogance, affirming that he orchestrated the entire thing with malicious intent, to bring me down, to revel in my despair. In a world that had painted me into a corner, I emerged, holding this tiny, clipped audio, a talisman of truth. Part of me wanted to send it off, share it with everyone who had ever judged me, but fear laced my hands. Who would believe me? I could feel the familiar voice in my head saying it was all just my fault for ever speaking to the counselor, that I had become nothing more than someone to be ridiculed. But I couldn't let Jacob's cruel laughter win. The next morning, I stood there, heart pounding, as I played the recording from Mrs. Perkins, tears of rage spilling over. She listened, the colors draining from her face, each slur echoing like a drum roll at a dark circus act. Days later, the principal called an emergency assembly, and for the first time in so long, the power had shifted. I stood in front of the student body, fog settling behind my eyes as I recounted the truth, knowing there may be repercussions but refusing to be the puppet in this horrid tale any longer. The gasps around the gymnasium filled the space like a chasm of realization, and the terrible weight of how I had felt for so long began to lift like a dawn breaking through a long night. Jacob faced the consequences. Suddenly, my once silent monster wore chains, and slowly the whispers turned into empathy. But still, as I left the auditorium that day, I could feel the air around me stifled with the remnants of hatred and, for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited. It wasn't an end, it was just the beginning of understanding that sometimes, telling the truth, no matter how painful, can set you free. Yet, no matter how much I felt liberated from the chains he had forged, I knew that I would carry the scars of that battle forever. So, I ask you, Ida, for telling the guidance counselor my classmate called me a slur? Because somewhere deep down, I am still that kid whose heart raced at the thought of being silenced, and to this day, that fear lingers, waiting for its moment to return. I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked, but now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace.